Good morning. I'm Jim Schmotter, President of Western Connecticut State University. And on behalf of the faculty and staff and students of this university, it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this morning for a really momentous occasion. You know, we are so pleased that Senators Blumenthal and Murphy and Representative Esty have come to us to organize this important program. This building has been open about 5 years, and in this ballroom, all kinds of events have taken place: academic convocations, celebrations of academic and athletic success, parties of various kinds, one including half a ton of sand. It was Hawaiian theme. Hopefully that's all gone by now. But I don't think any event in this room has touched upon issues that are more important than the ones that will be touched upon today. And certainly no event in this room has had a more distinguished panel of experts and government leaders to address the important issues that arose out of the tragedy of December 14th, 2012 in Newtown. We at this university are grateful to have an opportunity to host this because those events touched us as well. 36 of our faculty and staff live in Sandy Hook. Members of our university family lost members of their family in the attack. So we are pleased that we can host this event. We hope that as a learning institution, as a public university that convenes forums and discussions on important topics, that we can advance understanding of these issues, that we can course new directions that will help us in the future avoid the necessity to have conferences on the kind of events that occasioned our getting together this morning. So again, I welcome you all to Western and look forward to the morning ahead. Thank you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce one of the organizers of this event, a great public servant for the state of Connecticut and the nation, Senator Richard Blumenthal.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much to Western for hosting us, one of the great educational institutions of our state, and I particularly want to thank Senator Murphy, Congresswoman Esty, most especially Senator Murphy for spearheading and helping to organize this day. As I look at this room, I see so many leaders who can make change happen, from public officials to first responders to our leadership in law enforcement, our police, our firefighters. They're all represented in this room, along with public officials who reflect their constituencies. But most important, let me thank the families of victims who are here today. Your strength and courage inspire us to the action that we must take. Newtown is a call for action. And I want to thank other groups that have been so instrumental in helping to lead this effort: the Connecticut Against Gun Violence, the March for Change, Sandy Hook Promise, Newtown Action Alliance. We're all here to take the Sandy Hook Promise, to make sure that this opportunity and historic moment are seized. All around the world, Newtown captured the hearts of world leaders and ordinary people. It broke all of our hearts. But it did not destroy our determination. From that unspeakable horror, we will go to unstoppable action. The terror and tragedy of that moment can provide a trajectory for change. And today we will talk about specific action that we must take as a nation to make sure that there are no more Newtowns. No single state can do it alone. Gun violence is a scourge that spans state borders. Illegal trafficking in guns has no respect for state boundaries. And this problem must be solved through a national agenda for change. And we're going to be talking today about the specifics that we need for an action agenda, a national action agenda. Today is a summit of hope. As despairing and dissonant as many were in the wake of that tragedy, today we have hope, and as the President said, this time is different. This time is different because we are determined. And with your leadership, with your determination, we can make it happen. And we will make it happen. We must make it happen. So let me introduce someone who has been a leader for a long time in this area. I've worked on it since 1990, and he has been a leader as well, Senator Chris Murphy.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal. Thank you very much to Congresswoman Esty. Thank you to our teams who have helped organize this very important day. And let me add my thanks to the families who are here today, both the families of those who were tragically killed at Sandy Hook Elementary School, as well as families here representing the victims of gun violence in Connecticut's cities. Your heroism in the face of this tragedy, your ability to both grieve and advocate for your loved ones is an absolute inspiration, not just to those of us who have the honor of representing this state, but to people all across this country. And I know you know this, but though we will talk about policy change today, what has happened in the wake of Newtown is that literally billions of people across this world have looked inward to think about how they can change their lives, how they can be better people, how they can simply love a little bit more and hurt a little bit less. Those are the changes that may have the greatest lasting effect. But the policy changes that we talk about here today are incredibly important as well. And we've done a lot of talking here in Connecticut about state law changes. And I agree with Senator Blumenthal that though those are important, the most critical changes are those at the national level. And so we thought it was important today to spend a half a Thursday focusing on the debate at the federal level, because we haven't yet had that conversation here in Connecticut. And so over the course of the next several hours, you're going to hear from some of the leading voices, both at the local level and at the national level, on changing our gun laws, on investing in mental health, on making our schools and public places safer. And then at the end of the day, we're going to hear from our governor. We're going to hear from the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, who was wonderful enough to join the Vice President on a trip up to Western Connecticut, and then we're going to hear from Vice President Biden. It's going to be a busy day. There's going to be a lot to digest over the course of these next several hours. But I think at the end of this day, you will have the same kind of hope that we have, that Newtown did change everything, that the obstacles and the barriers that have existed to changes in our gun laws for decades came crumbling down on December 14th. And though there are still enormous forces of resistance in Washington and across this country and in Hartford, they pale in comparison to the power of the people in this room, the families and the community members and the advocates and the members of law enforcement and the elected leaders who now seek change as an imperative after Newtown. So we're going to have that conversation today, and I think that you'll draw something from it. We're going to talk about the changes that we need in gun laws. We're going to talk about the importance of universal background checks on a national scale and the imperative of taking dangerous military-style assault weapons and high-capacity magazines off our streets. We're going to talk about the danger of balancing our budgets on the backs of our mental health system and the continuing crisis in this country for families that do want to seek help for their loved one with a serious mental illness. We're going to talk about the right ways to make schools safer and the more holistic conversation we need to have about creating a positive culture in our schools where every student feels like they're a part of that community. We're going to try to talk about a lot of subjects here today because we know that there's no one panacea to gun violence in this country. 26 innocent lives lost in Newtown on that day, but every day since, over 30 people gunned down in incidents of gun violence across this country. We know that there's no one single solution, but if we talk about gun laws, if we talk about mental health funding, if we talk about school safety and community safety, we'll begin to get there. So I'm incredibly pleased that the Vice President will be here later today. I have to tell you that there is no way to overcome those forces of resistance, whether it be the NRA or the gun lobby or just all of the pundits who are always theorizing on why things can't happen in Washington. There's no way for us to make these big changes in Washington without leadership from the President and the Vice President of the United States. We cannot do it alone. And I think some people wondered when the President came out so forcefully on December 14th and 15th and 16th whether he would continue that strong advocacy or whether there would just be another crisis that would consume his time and his energy and his attention. Well, we've clearly seen the measure of President Obama and the measure of Vice President Biden. They are on a mission, like we are on a mission, to change the laws of this nation. And we were so excited when Vice President Biden eagerly accepted our invitation to come here and brought along with him another member of his task force, Secretary Duncan. I'm looking forward to this conversation today. I am so grateful to all of you for spending a portion of your day here with us today, recommitting ourselves to the notion that we will not stop until this nation learns its lessons and we do everything within our power to make sure that no community has to go through what Newtown has gone through over the last 2 months. With that, let me introduce to you my successor in the 5th District seat, a great leader on this issue, someone who is going to carry this torch for Connecticut and for Sandy Hook in the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty.
Thank you to my good friends, Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy, for your leadership on gun violence prevention, taking that powerfully to Washington, and for being there consistently for the families of Newtown. And I want to thank President Schmader and the entire WestConn community for hosting us here today. And thank you to all the panelists. I know many of you come from around the state, left your lives and your families to join us this morning. I particularly want to thank Lynn and Chris for being here to speak on behalf of families. Many of you are here in the audience today. Your courage, your leadership, your commitment in the face of unbearable loss, most of us cannot begin to imagine, and yet you get up every morning, not just that, but you come here, you tell your story, and you make sure that this country does not forget, that this country moves forward with meaningful action. And you are an inspiration to us every single day. And thank you for your courage and your strength that really know bounds that none of us can understand. 2 months ago, just 10 miles from here, the community of Newtown experienced an unspeakable tragedy that has propelled this nation to a long overdue conversation about action to address gun violence in this country. Gun violence has been unaddressed, allowed to creep up so that now we have the equivalent of a war of loss of life every year in this country. Over 30,000 of our brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, grandparents and children. That is unacceptable. These issues are complicated, we know that. We have wonderful panels here today addressing the myriad of issues: law enforcement, gun safety, mental health, school safety. The discussions are not easy, but they are necessary, and action needs to go forward. That, I think, we can agree on. We may not agree on everything. These are passionate issues, I know. But what I wanted to talk for a minute about was the price of inaction, because that is why we're here today. We are here today because we have seen the price of inaction in the faces of 20 angelic children taken from us. They weren't lost. They were murdered. They were taken from us. And that, folks, that is the price this country is paying. That is the price these families have paid. That is the price of the families here in Bridgeport who are here for their children and their loved ones who were murdered on the streets of our cities in gun violence. That loss not only was that day, it's every day. I was talking with Lynn and Chris O'Donnell week before last, and 6 of the girls were in the same Daisy Girl Scout troop. So you think about every single time there's a graduation or a birthday party, that loss is ongoing. And I don't know about you, but I was outraged last week when someone who has worked for the NRA as a lobbyist talked about how we should just wait for the Connecticut effect to pass. And I think your presence here today is a strong statement. That effect is not about to pass. It is felt every day, and we are going to stand strong, and we are going to stand united as a country to stop this slaughter, to work together, because this is an American problem. This is an American problem. It's not a political problem. It's an American problem that we have got to work together, respecting the rights of gun owners, but finding a way to keep our children safe in schools, finding a way to make it safe to walk our city streets, finding a way that people do not need to be worried in their homes. And that is what unites us, that commitment for more safety, for long and happy lives, for every child in this country. Because what happened, we could not stop what happened 2 months ago. But what happens now is up to us. What happens now is up to those of us in this room. It is up to every elected official, and it is up to every person. As the senators spoke, this is not just about changing minds. It's about changing hearts. We have to look deep into our hearts and think about our priorities as a country. Think about what we value as a people. And I think when we do that, I know we will find a way forward. We will find a way. There are sensible, common sense gun safety laws that we can and we will pass. Not just at the state, but also in Washington. You know, I get asked, you know, people say, well, Elizabeth, you're new. You know, you don't know what it's like. The NRA will show you. This has happened before. It happened in Aurora, happened in Columbine, happened in Virginia Tech. It'll pass. You won't get anything done. I don't believe that. I know that's not true. This is different. This time is different because we are going to make it different. We are making it different. We must give voice to those lives that have been taken from us, because that is the promise of our future as our country. Think about what these 20 children might have been able to do for this great country, any one of them, any one of them. And that loss is what we fight for today, to have the future for each and every child. So the Connecticut effect is not passing. It is galvanizing us to action. It is galvanizing us to work together to find and build that common ground that we must have to move forward. So again, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank in particular the senators and their excellent staff for bringing you folks here today. And I want to thank you, the elected leaders and the families, for your commitment, for your courage, and for your inspiration to spur us on to do what we must do in this great country. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite our first panel to please join me here. Let me begin by introducing each of the panelists who are here today, beginning with Mayor Segarra, known to many of you. He was elected in 2010, Pedro Segarra of Hartford, and he has enacted Opportunities Hartford, focusing on improvement in the income, education, and employment of city residents. He knows all too well the toll that guns take on lives every day. He lost his own father to gun violence and has worked tirelessly, absolutely tirelessly, to reduce the number of shootings in his own city of Hartford, our state's capital. Connecticut State Police Captain Dale Horgan has served for 34 years in law enforcement. He's presently commanding officer of the statewide narcotics task force. He served as one of the commanders in response to the Sandy Hook shooting, where I saw him particularly coordinating family victim services, and he previously served on the statewide firearms trafficking task force. Chris and Lynn McDonald are here. The McDonalds are 21-year residents of Newtown. They're the parents of Jack, 12 years old, and Grace, who was 7. When she was killed at Sandy Hook. Grace was a beautiful, artistic child who wanted to live on the beach and become a painter. Matt Bennett is Senior Vice President for Public Affairs and co-founder of the Third Way. He has served as Deputy Assistant to President Clinton in the White House for Intergovernmental Affairs. Third Way is an organization dedicated to seeking pragmatic solutions to many of the difficult national problems, including gun violence. As an organization, it has been very active on gun violence. Stacy Spell, retired 28-year detective, New Haven Police Department. Stacy served 6 years in the police unit that investigated all homicides and shootings. He's an Army veteran and works with inner-city youth. Don Basile is a 25-year firearms training expert, working with many individuals on responsible gun ownership and operation. Let me begin by asking each of the panelists to make a brief, maybe about 2 minutes statement, and let me just set the agenda by saying there are a number of very specific proposals now before the Judiciary Committee of the United States Senate. I believe many of them will be approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee sometime next month, and then we'll reach a vote in the Senate. We're not talking about abstract, theoretical ideas here. A ban on assault weapons and large capacity magazines is achievable. Penalties for the first time on illegal trafficking, 30 years for someone who knowingly buys a firearm in the name of someone else as a straw purchaser. Someone who sells, 10 years in prison as a licensed gun dealer is achievable if that person knows it was illegal. A measure that will expand criminal background checks for all firearms purchases, closing the gun show loophole, and for ammunition purchases. Right now there are no background checks for ammunition purchases. They are achievable. And improving the database that's used for those background checks is not only achievable, but the President of the United States has started that process in motion. Those kinds of measures, including the mental health initiatives, right now there's a mental health first aid bill that I've sponsored before the Judiciary Committee, are all achievable, along with more gun safety measures in our schools. Gun safety and school safety are absolutely critical. 2 months ago, gun violence and measures to stop it were untouchable politically. 2 months ago, this topic was untouchable. Today, it is achievable, in fact, unstoppable, if we have the kind of solidarity and steadfastness that many of these leaders have demonstrated, beginning with the President of the United States. Never in my years has any president been so determined and resolute and outspoken on this subject. Others have talked about it, but you have seen his face, many of you in this room who spoke to him when he visited Newtown that Sunday after the killing. You know firsthand what's in his heart. You saw his eyes, you heard his voice. You know he is determined to make it happen. And the forces of resistance, as strong as they once appeared, are a shadow of what they were. So the panel that we have today can talk about these specifics from personal experience and expertise, and I'd like to ask Mayor Segarra to begin the discussion.
Well, thank you, Senator, and thank you, Senator Murphy and the congressional delegation for getting involved in this very important issue. You know, 150 years ago, we were debating in this country whether individuals had the right to be free, whether people had equal right of freeing themselves from slavery and everyone being free. 150 years later, we're having the debate whether we have the right to exist. So it is a challenge as an urban mayor, as it is for many mayors, to turn our cities around in this difficult economy. And we know that crime is one of the primary issues that can make or break a city. We have learned from cities of New York that have been able to enforce very strong legislation for gun control and have had their economies improved. And then we see other cities that are having homicide rates that are shooting through the roof. I was saddened and concerned last night when I saw in the news bulletproof equipment, backpacks for little children as a means of keeping them safe. And it really saddened me that those are the options that we are exploring rather than having comprehensive national legislation, because we know what we need to do to keep our community safe. The only question is whether we have the resolve to do something about this problem with gun violence. So again, I thank you. Again, my deepest and sincerest condolences to the families of Newtown, to the families of Hartford, Mr. Sam Saylor, who lost his son here several months back. We were hoping that we would end the year at 19 homicides because it would have made it the lowest homicide rate in 20, 30 years. And unfortunately, his son was the 20th victim of that year. And we know what we need to do. The question that remains is, do we have the resolve? Do we have the resolve to do it? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Captain Horgan.
Good morning, Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, Congresswoman Esty, other invited dignitaries, victim families. Thank you for this opportunity today to be here and be involved in the dialogue of such great importance. And first and foremost, to the McDonald family and to all the victim families that are represented here today and those that could not attend today, on behalf of all of my colleagues in law enforcement from across the United States, please accept our sympathy and our condolences. On December 14th, that morning began as most other days. Many of us reported to work, to our duty assignments. And then over the radio, we heard the call, active shooter, Sandy Hook Elementary School, Newtown, Connecticut. The call went out. Local police officers, state troopers, and federal law enforcement agents from across the area responded. But tragically, upon our arrival, we learned that 20 first graders had been killed, along with 6 teachers and 2 teachers wounded. Those shots reverted around our state, across our country, and throughout the world. And it's resulted in almost forced a dialogue, and that's why we're here today. It's our hope as law enforcement officers that as a result our laws are strengthened and we're able to keep illegal weapons out of the hands of ineligible people, while also balancing the rights of the lawful, law-abiding citizens that we are sworn to protect and serve. The Connecticut State Police and our local counterparts and our federal counterparts in the state of Connecticut have enjoyed a long-standing relationship. And we've been fighting gun violence for a long time, and we see the unfortunate results of violence in our communities, in our cities, our towns, almost on a daily basis. One of the things that we've been successful with, one of our premier programs, has been the cold case shooting team that has worked in Hartford for a number of years. It's become a model, and it's been picked up by other towns and cities throughout the state of Connecticut. And we hope that we can continue our work with the support of legislators. It's going to require an investment, but first and foremost, it's going to require a commitment from the community. Without the community's support, we're not effective. We need to identify people that are involved in illegal activities, people that possess illegal weapons, and we need to work together to remove them from the streets and make our towns and cities and our schools and all our public lives a lot safer. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. I'd like to ask Chris and Lynn McDonald to please say a few words.
Thank you, Senators Blumenthal, Murphy, Congresswoman Estes, for inviting us here to speak, to allow us to share our story and allow us to have our voices heard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Lynn McDonald. On December 14th, we lost the love and light of our family, our daughter Grace. After that day, I made a promise to her that I would be her voice. We promised Grace that we would be fearless in our efforts. We want Gracie to be celebrated, to be heard, and to be remembered. And by our presence here today, it is our sincere hope that in sharing our loss with you, she will be heard. We are strengthened and deeply appreciative by everyone's commitment here today to help make a change. We hope others, guided by their own moral compasses, will also feel the need to act and act now. We ask that our representatives look into their hearts and remember the 26 beautiful lives that we lost and pass meaningful laws that will help prevent this from happening again. We owe it to our children, and I owe it to my daughter, Grace.
Thank you. Matt Bennett.
Thank you, Senator, to the McDonalds and to the other families, both of Sandy Hook and other victims of violence. Let me say on behalf of my organization, everybody working to address this issue in Washington, that we are inspired by your courage and your commitment to this. Picture this scene for a moment. It's nighttime. A van pulls into an alleyway. Guy gets out of the van, opens up the back, and it's loaded with guns. Somebody emerges from the shadows. He's smoking a cigarette, throws it on the ground, takes out a wad of bills, peels off a few, hands it to the guy, takes a Glock 9, sticks it in his waistband, and walks away. Another guy comes up, does the same thing, and they disappear into the night. The only crime that's been committed here is littering. I'm here to talk to you about federal gun laws. The laws that we have on the books are effective, but they're not enough. And through the leadership of the folks that you heard from this morning already and others, we're trying to change that right now, and we think that the prospects for change, because of the leadership coming from this state, are good. Before 1968, there essentially were no federal gun laws in the United States. There was a law against fully automatic machine guns, but other than that, there was no law. After the assassinations of King and Kennedy, and with the rise in urban violence in '68, the Congress passed what's called the Gun Control Act of '68, and it established some categories of people that are, under federal law, prohibited from owning guns. Most importantly, felons, what they called in the '60s mentally defective people, illegal immigrants, and a few other classes of folks. But until 1993, it was essentially the honor system. There was no way to check whether someone fell into one of these categories or not. In 1993, thanks to the courage and commitment of another victim of gun violence, Jim and his wife Sarah Brady, after 12 years of work from the time that he was shot in the Reagan assassination attempt in '81, in '93, the Brady Act was signed into law. And since 1998, the Brady Act established an instant check system, which has been in force for the last 15 years or so, and it works very, very well. More than 2.1 million people who should not have guns, felons, the mentally ill, and others, have been stopped from trying to buy guns by the Brady Act and the instant check system, which actually is instant. It works very fast. 92% of checks are done within minutes, and it works very well under stress. Last year, 16 million people went through a background check, and nearly 200 million have gone through background checks since the system was established in 1998. It's good. It could be better. It needs to be improved, but it is a very good system to keep guns away from people who shouldn't have them. The problem is that it is full of loopholes, and those loopholes are the things that we are all working to close. The biggest is that if you are buying a gun from someone who is not a licensed dealer, you do not have to go through a background check. No one knows how many times this happens every year, but it's a lot of times. It could be up to 40% of all gun sales are in these private transactions without any questions asked of the type that I talked about at the beginning. So we need to expand background checks to make them universal, to cover all sales of guns. Second thing we need to do is crack down on the kinds of gun runners that I described at the outset. We know that guns move in very well-established patterns from states with weak gun laws to states like this one with tough gun laws, and that most guns change hands more than once from the time they are a legal product to the time they're used in crime. And there are many, many indicia of gun trafficking that we know about, and the other thing, besides expanding the background check system, one other thing that we're doing now is trying to crack down on those gun runners. And then finally, as you've heard, we need to take assault weapons and high-capacity magazines off the streets, the things that were used in Newtown and in Aurora and in other horrible shootings. There's no reason for weapons of war to be on our streets. So thank you to the senators, Congresswoman, and to all of you for having me here today. I look forward to the discussion.
Stacey Spell.
Good morning, all. First, I'd like to thank the senators for extending the invitation for me to be a part of this panel and to be in the presence of the dignitaries that are here. To the McDonald's, there are not enough words in all of the languages of the world to touch your loss. But know this, that there are people praying with you and praying for you. The first point that, for me, that is so important is that we have a responsibility to our children. Our children are growing up in communities where they are scarred by gunfire, by illegal handguns, by the threat of being able to attend school safely. No matter whether you are an opponent or you are an advocate for gun control, we have to make a change. Future generations are being scarred. The development of our children and their psyche are being affected. As a father and a grandfather, I think of the legacy that I will leave my children. And what did I do to make a difference in this world? What did I do beyond just what was my job? There's a common denominator in what affects the urban communities with the proliferation of handguns and the suburban communities where we're seeing assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, and that is the death and carnage that they leave in their wake. We are past the days of the wild, wild west, where that a gun was a necessity for protection and daily life. Outside of law enforcement, myself, I don't see the need for assault-style weapons, for high-capacity magazines. As a person that has investigated numerous homicides and attended too many funerals, the time is now to make a change. We have to move from denial that everything is fine on how we conduct business around gun control. Yes, we can be aware of everyone's Second Amendment rights, but at the same time, we know that we have to change how we're handling these issues. I can't express enough that we have to make a change, not for the elders like me who have gray in their chin and on their hair. We have to make a change for those children. They are our futures. And we want to make sure that we leave them with a legacy that we, those of us that are responsible, those of us that are aware, those of us that are tenacious to confront and make a social change, try to do so. Thank you.
Don Basile.
Hello, everyone. The acts on December 14th were incomprehensible, and regardless of which side of the fence you may sit on the gun issue, it's something that no one could have foreseen or completely incomprehensible. I have 25 years experience in various training and disciplines within the gun community. I am pro-gun. I pride myself on being a responsible gun owner. I'm here today because I sincerely wish to be a part of the healthy dialogue, and I sincerely wish to be a part of the solution. I feel that the crux of the problem is the access of firearms with those with bad intent. I think if we're able to make that important division as the premise of this forum between those that use firearms in a lawful manner and those that use them in a criminal manner, I think we'll be able to move forward and actually make some progress on this. But some of the initial mistakes of lumping everyone under the same umbrella is where the tug of rope and the friction begins. I look forward to being part of this discussion, and again, I'm happy to be here and be a part of the solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the panelists to react to each other. I think Dom makes a very, very important point. Nobody wants to infringe on the Second Amendment or take away guns from people who have rights under the Second Amendment, simply to keep guns out of the hands of people who are criminals, who are seriously mentally ill, who are domestic abusers. And let me pose to each of you what I think is sort of a common theme, that we need action at the national level. No state is an island. No state can do it alone, because the streets of Hartford or New Haven are imperiled by guns that are brought here from elsewhere. And Connecticut has laws. In fact, many of us, including myself in this room, championed them in the early 1990s. I went to court to defend our assault weapon ban, and the head of the NRA says all of these laws, as recently as last night, said they are just cosmetic. They are feel-good. So, two-part question to react to each other. Do these laws make a difference? And why do we need them at the national level? Maybe we can begin with Matt, if you want to address that question.
Sure, thanks, Senator. Let me talk first about why they're needed at the national level. Every year there's about 500,000 crimes involving guns, not only murder or shootings, but also any time a gun is brandished in a crime. In about 145,000 of those cases, a gun is recovered by law enforcement, and many of those, not all, but many are traced to find out where they came from. In 9 out of 10 of these traces of crime guns, the criminal who used the gun was not the original purchaser of the gun. So that's fact number one. Number two, in 1 out of every 3 gun crimes, the crime was committed in a state that was not the place where the gun was originally purchased, and it is not legal to, in most cases, to carry guns across state lines. And number three, the typical age of a criminal using a gun is 19, followed by 18, followed by 20, followed by 17. But it is illegal under federal law for anyone under the age of 21 to possess a handgun, and they're used in the overwhelming majority of gun crimes. So taken together, these facts show that we have an enormous problem with gun trafficking. The guns used in crime in most states come from other places. Or, even if it's inside a state, the gun is trafficked from where it's a legal product till it gets into the hands of criminals. The only way to deal with gun trafficking is with federal gun laws. In fact, the NYPD, so fed up with the Bush administration's failure to crack down on gun trafficking from the South into New York, was sending investigators into my state, Virginia, to do undercover investigations of gun stores there. That's ridiculous. The NYPD shouldn't have to do that. This is a federal responsibility, and we need better federal laws to crack down on trafficking.
Captain, would you agree?
Yes, sir. I think we need a standardized set of laws that all 50 states abide by so that we're all in tune and in sync. Having been in the business of investigating firearms trafficking cases, I agree. But there have also been some other problems that we have encountered. And they're relatively simple solutions, I believe. One, in Connecticut and in most states, we have certain laws that identify people as being ineligible. It's illegal for them to buy or possess a weapon. But yet, a person can acquire a weapon, he could steal it, he can buy it illegally, but then that person can walk into any store that sells ammunition, and all they have to show is that they're over the age of 21, and they can acquire bullets for that weapon. I think we need to address that issue. Also, we've had a couple of investigations in Connecticut where we've had manufacturers importing weapons into the United States for retail sale, and those shipments have been moved from warehouses to gun manufacturers over our interstate highways by tractor trailer, and the truck is driven by a convicted felon who along the way stops and steals guns from the cargo. Why would we allow someone to transport weapons who's a convicted felon and trust that that load, that shipment will arrive at his destination intact?
Thank you. Mayor?
The work that needs to be done at the municipal level to counter the effects of bad policy and legislation are just overwhelming. We have done significant work through our shooting task force, which is a joint effort with the state, to decrease the number of shootings and homicides and recoup lots of weapons. Just this week we recouped 3 high-capacity weapons, one of which was a Bushmaster. The same week that we had the Sandy Hook tragedy, we recouped from a hotel a Bushmaster assault weapon as well. The proliferation of these weapons is just so prevalent that it really drains our resources, and we have to switch priorities for a very poor community to expend the incredible amount of resources just to try to counter the effects of what is incongruent and inefficient national legislation that creates a circumstance for our city of having to then deal with the problem associated with these guns and assault rifles and weapons being in our streets.
You know, I think these points are very, very well taken. I just want to add a note to give credit where credit is due, that Connecticut actually is at the forefront of measures to prevent gun violence. We have some state legislators here and other leaders who have been involved. I have been for more than 20 years as State Attorney General and as United States Attorney. But as much as we are in the forefront and helping to lead the nation, our laws are not enough. And I want to thank Captain Hargan particularly because it was our law enforcement people who came to me with the idea of background checks for ammunition purchases. Right now, somebody who is a convicted felon or a fugitive or a drug addict or a domestic abuser or seriously mental ill can walk into a store, buy a shopping cart full of ammunition, no questions asked, pay for it without any check whatsoever. And part of what I have proposed is at the suggestion of our law enforcement people here in the state of Connecticut is background checks for those kinds of purchases, recognizing there may be a burden on the background check system. We have to make sure that we fulfill that responsibility. Let me ask Dom Basile, what about better training for people and safety measures in the schools and education, safety locks, better measures at home? What role do you think those kinds of steps can take?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you. My assessment of what happened on December 14th was that someone that should not have had access to a firearm was able to gain access to the firearm. We still don't know all the facts. The state police have not released their official report. But from what I've been told, Nancy Lanza did not have her firearms properly secured. I think that's the crux of the problem. Had Adam Lanza not been able to gain access to any of her firearms, it wouldn't have happened. What I think that we can do, what I think is a common sense approach that everyone can come together and do, both sides of the aisle, would be for our legislators to do something to help act as a catalyst to want gun owners to be responsible gun owners and purchase gun safes, gun vaults. And what the government's skin in the game would be on this, because it is a compromise, you give and you get. What the government's skin in the game would be on this would be that if you purchase a gun vault, you hang on to your receipt, you keep it with your tax papers, and then you can write it off on your income tax. I think that is a reasonable approach that's easily workable, and it would instantaneously do something to mitigate the crux of the problem, which is accessibility to the firearms. Here in Connecticut, talking about illegal trafficking, here in Connecticut, we had a firearms trafficking task force. They were put in place. Their job was solely to go after the illegal trafficking of firearms. And they were successful in doing that in their freshman year. They took hundreds of guns off the street, hundreds of guns that were in the hands of the wrong people. Those were the threat to our society. And then here on the state level, our legislators decided to defund that program and disband them. Now there is pending legislation to bring them back. I support that legislation. That's a way to go after the problem being the wrong people having access to these firearms. Thank you.
Any reactions on either side of the table.
The more I listen to Dom, it's apparent that we are more alike than different.
I'm happy to hear that.
And I think that when we truly communicate, as I said, whether you're an advocate or an opponent, when it comes down to the welfare of our children, we're going to find a common ground. And it's that common ground that we have to seek. We know that there have to be changes. We know, especially in my community, that the guns that are recovered in crimes, a lot of them are from Virginia, North Carolina. As we look to strengthen the measures we're creating here in Connecticut, we also have to look to North Carolina and to Virginia and to the states of the Mid-Atlantic, so that the straw buyer cannot go and take a 6-hour ride to Northern Virginia, purchase a trunkload of weapons, and bring them back here and sell them with impunity. New Haven and Hartford are the only two towns in the state that have a shooting task force. We need more. The federal government, the ATF, they do an excellent job, but they're inundated. And just as well as our local municipalities and the state police. But we know that we have to do more, that we have to find the funding to support the creation of new teams and go for stronger investigations, as well as the prosecution, because one of the factors that happens in my community and a lot of urban communities is that you'll have repeat offenders. We have to accept that there are going to be some people that no matter how good of our intentions of trying to give them a second chance, they are not worthy to walk the streets of Connecticut. And for those repeat offenders, we have to have stronger measures to make sure that you didn't understand. You're not allowed to possess a handgun. You're not allowed to have a weapon. And then when they're caught in possession of one or utilizing one, then your days of walking the community that you live in are over.
Matt?
Yeah, I would offer up that not only do we have a moral responsibility to our children, we have a moral responsibility to each other as we go through our lives and through society. By all accounts, at least by my yardstick, there's probably 52 sets of laws on the books as it relates to handguns and gun legislation in general. The 50 states, the District of Columbia, and then at the federal level. I do think that there should be a national, two areas of national focus. One is on legislation to remove the threat, and the other is on gun safety. We have national standards on many industries, automotive and so forth. Why not have a national set of standards to provide the stimulus for the gun industry in general and for those advocates of guns to move to a safer place, to be able to have things that allow for a transformation, such that we're not dealing with punitive measures, but we're dealing with really proactive approaches towards gun safety.
Matt?
I'd like to just respond to one point that Stacey made. I totally agree. We need more resources at the federal level to help do the investigations. Just to give you a sense of it, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives not only has guns to deal with, they also have alcohol and tobacco, and there's not very many of them. By contrast, there are 59,000 federally licensed firearms dealers in the United States. If ATF were to inspect every single one of them, it would take 22 years. So that isn't happening, and the consequence is that you have a lot of dirty gun dealers. My community, many years ago, was ravaged by the Washington area sniper, a guy named John Mohammed, who was a domestic abuser, and he knew he couldn't pass a background check in his home state of Washington. So he went to a dirty gun dealer, well known to the community of criminals, called Bullseye Shooter Supply. This is a guy who had been shut down by ATF already and opened up under a different name. And he obtained a 4-foot-long, $1,000 gun that Bullseye had reported shoplifted. Obviously, it wasn't shoplifted. It was sold to John Mohammed without a background check, and that happens every day, all the time. So ATF is massively outmanned, and another thing that we need to do is help federal law enforcement get the resources they need to go after the criminals that are selling guns to other criminals.
ATF is undermanned and has been without a leader for 6 years. There's been no appointee confirmed by the Senate of the United States for 6 years. It's been leaderless, as well as under-resourced and undermanned. And I think, since we're being very blunt here, the best laws in the books obviously are dead letter if they're not enforced aggressively. And I think where we have common ground with some of the opponents of reform, the NRA specifically, is that we need better enforcement. We need more resources, more aggressiveness, and Detective Spell, I think, raises a very good point. Prosecutors and judges need to take these crimes more seriously. They need more resources to enforce them more aggressively, but there need to be tougher sentences and more aggressive investigation. So I appreciate those points that you made. Any reactions?
I agree, Senator. When you just spoke about sentencing and removing these people from our streets, the courts, our prosecutors, we need to all work together. And it's frustrating from a law enforcement perspective when my colleagues and I go out into the field and we make an arrest and we find that the individual we've arrested has been through the system multiple times and has a rather lengthy arrest record, and they've been picked up with weapons in the past, but they've been reduced or nollied or changed. And these are the same customers that we deal with, and they need to learn their lesson. They need to spend some time behind bars and away from our children and help, again, make those neighborhoods safe. As far as legislative support, in these types of meetings, having a dialogue with our federal legislators and our state legislators, meeting with law enforcement and judicial and concerned citizens to get the message across and to identify what our needs are. This is a unique opportunity. We've certainly grasped it, and you and your colleagues have been instrumental in fostering those discussions, and they're long overdue. Sometimes we feel alone out there as far as law enforcement. We're dealt with conditions and situations that we have no control over, but it does require a substantial investment. There are many programs that are in place. Some of them are in jeopardy. The counter-drug program from the United States Army, which provides support to law enforcement, their budget is questionable. The National HIDTA program, the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Acts, which certainly pour money into our departments to help us dismantle and disrupt drug trafficking organizations, which there's always a common denominator. Most of our violent crimes, you can trace the roots back to drugs. And when we go out and conduct our drug investigations, we often encounter weapons. And it would behoove us to do a better job in providing that financial support and that investment so that we could do a better job for you.
And I think our state police, and we have many local chiefs here as well, who have demonstrated over the years that they are very concerned and have really devoted a lot of energy and effort to helping to prevent gun violence in their communities. And often it will be gun violence involving suicides or other kinds of really preventable instances that involve better mental health and those kinds of services. And our next panel will deal with them as well. So it's not a single solution that we need. It is really a comprehensive strategy. Mayor?
Well, I just want to again reiterate that the cost of making up for the lack of federal legislation is being borne by the very poor residents of my city. And I wish there was a way that the cost of having to deal with the problem could be shifted to those that want to have such a large-scale flexibility in terms of the gun issue, because, you know, we did a gun buyback program in Hartford. We were buying back 1 weapon per minute. We ran out of money. Same thing happened in Bridgeport and New Haven. So I think that in urban communities you are seeing a pattern where people recognize the damage that's being done by this proliferation of guns and are willing to have these guns off the street. I just really wish that the cost that is associated with that is either borne by the industry or others that are sort of seem to be at the steering wheel of this issue. So we need, in the process of doing the federal legislation, to make sure that we apportion the cost of gun control and gun regulation upon those that are profiting from it.
Thank you. Did you? Yes, Dom?
Yes, sir. Again, I also agree as far as the enforcement aspect goes. Getting back to December 14th, if I could, if you really look at the events of that morning, literally every single facet of what Adam Lanza did that day was already covered by existing law. There are no voids, there are no shortcomings. In that regard, there's nothing to fix. There's nothing to remedy. We need to enforce the laws that we have. According to NBC and other news sources, and again, the official study has not come out yet, but they've reported that Adam Lanza tried to buy a rifle at Dick's Sporting Goods here in Danbury on December 11th, and he was denied. So the laws work.
I just want to say that, to simply say that everything that could have been done has been done in order to avoid that tragedy is extremely inaccurate. I think that this and I agree with Detective Spell that to some degree we are no different. I have an incredible fear of guns because they killed my father. They killed my best two childhood friends, which will forever affect the way that I think about friendships and relationships. And I know that people that are very strong about possessing weapons are also very fear about what can happen to them in certain circumstances if they don't have access to a gun. But we need to overcome this culture of fear. We need to take grasp of how guns came to have the role that they actually play in our society. Start to deconstruct that. Start to acknowledge the fact that the overwhelming majority of American families want their children to be safe. And
well, yes, Mayor. I want people to be safe too. I agree with you on that. But again, I'm trying to look at this more analytically. And if you study the events that happened that morning, I mean, he stole someone else's firearms. He was 20 years old and in possession of 2 handguns. That's illegal. He stole her car, breaking and entering into the school, et cetera, et cetera. There are many laws. Everything that he did is already covered by an existing law. That's my statement, and it's a factual statement. The one caveat to that, which I've already addressed, was how Nancy Lanza stored and secured those firearms, and we've already addressed that.
And let me just point out that this is not an either-or situation. You know, we need stronger and better laws. We also need better enforcement. The two are mutually supportive. They go together. So I think you're really not debating or differing with each other so much as saying one is more necessary than the other. And that's the way we can be defeated, if we're divided. And that's what the opponents would like to do. Rather than common ground, common sense solutions, they'd like to say, well, everything's fine as it is, or all we need to do is enforce the existing laws more aggressively. But we know that we need stronger laws, and let's talk for the moment about high-capacity magazines. One of the most moving pieces of testimony before any Senate committee I've seen was Gabby Giffords and her husband, Captain Mark Kelly. First, Gabby Giffords saying, you must be courageous, you must be bold. The American people are counting on it. But then Mark Kelly talking about the tragedy in Tucson. Christina Taylor, 9 years old, was killed with the 13th bullet. And the shooter was stopped because he had to change magazines. If his gun had had a 10-round magazine, Christina Taylor, as Mark Kelly said so movingly, would be alive today. We know that in Newtown, 11 children escaped when the shooter had to change magazines. If high-capacity magazines had been banned, boys and girls in Newtown would be alive today, perhaps more. So we know also that in Tucson, if the shooter had undergone a background check, he never would have been able to purchase the ammunition and the firearms that he did if the national database had been accurate and complete. So there are measures that are necessary to strengthen these laws, and let's talk about the background checks and the high-capacity magazines. Matt, I know you have some thoughts about it.
Thank you, Senator. Of course, that's right. There are other things brought to bear on Newtown, and certainly high-capacity magazines is one of them. In addition, in other tragedies of this type, there have been federal laws that have been directly implicated. For example, after Columbine, the girlfriend of Dylan Klebold testified for the Colorado State Legislature that she purchased one of the guns for him, used not knowing what he was going to do, but she bought him a gun because he was underage. And what she said was she bought it at a gun show from a private seller. And she testified that had she been asked to undergo a background check, which she would have passed because she had a clean record, she wouldn't have done it. So after Columbine, residents of Colorado rose up and passed a ballot initiative to close the loophole that allowed that kind of sale at gun shows in that state. But it's just not enough to do it state by state. We have to have federal measures that expand background checks to make sure that these kinds of things are stopped. And Senator, to your point about falling through the cracks of the system, the murderer at Virginia Tech should have been stopped by a background check, but he wasn't because there are holes in the NICS system, the National Instant Check system, that allowed him to slip through the cracks. One of the problems with the mental health category of prohibited persons is that it's very difficult to get all the records into place. You're barred from owning a gun under the mental health prohibition if you've been adjudicated mentally ill by a court or if you've been involuntarily committed to a mental institution. On the one hand, these are very narrow exceptions. Very few people are involuntarily committed because the way it works is generally you sign yourself in, even if you're brought to a mental health institution. So there aren't very many people, and the people that should be in the system often aren't. In the NICS system today, there is one person from the state of Pennsylvania who is in there because of mental health. And surely the state of Pennsylvania has got a few more. So there are a lot of things that we need to do to improve the system. And one, just quickly on the question of high-capacity magazines, there's no question that it had an impact in the very high-profile tragedies that we've talked about already, but it has an impact also on the streets. I'd be curious to hear what folks in law enforcement say, because often they find their officers outgunned by criminals who are able to use not only assault weapons, but high-capacity magazines to fight battles with police.
Thank you. Captain Horgan, let me ask you to comment on the high-capacity magazines and also assault weapons.
First, if I may, I'd like to make a comment on the mental health. I couldn't agree any more. You presented a very accurate and detailed description of some of the obstacles we face, and I think we need to make some changes in the HIPAA laws and enable doctors to have effective communication, dissemination of information, so that we can enter that into existing databases that would aid us in prohibiting those people from getting possession of weapons. I think if we look and evaluate most of these cases, they were people that had problems and should have never had access to weapons, period. As far as the assault weapon ban, I could speak in my capacity as the former commanding officer of the statewide firearms trafficking task force. The law was passed some time ago, and it's never been updated. And as technology has progressed and gun manufacturers have changed their manufacturing techniques, some of these weapons were able to skirt the law and be available for sale. The legislation needs to be reviewed continually and updated as manufacturing techniques change and as new weapons are designed and marketed. And that's really a call for the public. I would support whatever the community wants to do as far as a ban on assault weapons and magazines. Again, balancing the legal and lawful people that we have in this country. By all means, I don't want to go up against them in my position as a police officer, nor do my colleagues. And they actually represent a smaller amount of weapons that we seize. We predominantly seize a lot of handguns, a lot of stolen handguns, weapons that are easily concealable and in use by gangs and people in trafficking narcotics. We do seize long weapons and stolen weapons, but we really need to perfect the law and update it and make it easily understood. A lot of police officers find it complicated. Often prosecutors find it complicated. Some judges don't understand it, and we often have to spend a lot of time with them educating them on what's a banned weapon and what's a compliant weapon. So I think that needs to be really clarified and addressed.
Mayor?
On the issue of the magazines, we need some federal uniformity. And when that uniformity happens, hopefully the national government will explore what the impact would be if New York has a 7 bullet capacity magazine, what the implications would be for Connecticut if ours is at 10. Does that open up a market in Connecticut for those munitions? So there needs to be federal uniformity, absolutely, with respect to the magazine issue. On the issue of mental health, you know, the prognostic indicators in terms of who should possess and who should not possess weapons are very clear. For those in the psychiatric community and in the psychotherapy community, it's very easy, whether it be through testing or through clinical observation, what are the prognostic indicators that should preclude someone from being around or have access to a gun. What we need to do is to afford our law enforcement community with better information in terms of enforcing and allowing the mental health community to have clear communication and access to our law enforcement communities so that we can do the enforcement piece. And also, lastly, the resources that are being put forth towards mental health services, especially in urban areas, need to be funded. You can't do mental health and you can't do the preventative work of sorting out who should have access to guns if you don't have the resources to serve that community.
You know, just another illustration, and I know Captain Horgan is familiar with this area and Detective Spell as well. Illegal trafficking. People don't realize that right now there's no federal law that punishes someone from selling a weapon to someone posing as someone else, the straw purchases. And one reason why I'm just very proud to have co-sponsored a measure to bar illegal trafficking with Senators Leahy, who, by the way, is the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and Senator Durbin, we're leading the effort on this measure, is that I've seen firsthand what the consequences are. I dealt with a gentleman by the name of Frank D'Andrea, who was known for many years. He owned D'Andrea's gun case in Stratford, Connecticut for decades. He was the gun seller of choice for the gangsters and drug traffickers and illegally sold guns to them. But there was no law that specifically prohibited, no federal law when I was U.S. Attorney that specifically prohibited those kinds of straw sales or illegal trafficking. And I once questioned him, as a matter of fact, under oath, and asked him whether he had any reservation about selling vast amounts of guns to criminals, and he said to me, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's almost the exact quote. His answer was he'd gladly sell the entire contents of his store to a single person, no matter who it was. He was eventually convicted. He was sentenced to 3.5 years, which is a relatively minor term of imprisonment, even with the most aggressive investigation and law enforcement. Had our measure been in effect at the time, he would have faced a considerably longer prison term, and he could have been stopped well before then for those straw sales and illegal trafficking. So these laws make a difference. Better laws, stronger laws, make a difference in empowering our police, our law enforcement enforcers, and our prosecutors. And I think that one is a particularly important measure, common sense, common ground, that needs to be approved. We're nearing the end, so I'm going to ask all of our panelists maybe just to make some final remarks, if you would, in no particular order. Chris?
Yeah, I just, for me, the arithmetic is fairly simple. On December 14th, had there been an assault weapons ban in existence and a high-capacity magazine ban in existence, the statistics would be different. That's cannot be disputed. The other thing that I hope is discussed at the following panel is a point I brought up before. We have a moral obligation to our children. We also have a moral obligation to each other. We don't knowingly or willingly give keys to our car to someone who is clearly inebriated. We know what the cause and effect will be. What wasn't discussed, and hopefully will be discussed at the following panel, is the moral responsibility of gun owners, and whether Nancy Lanza knowingly provided the environment for Adam Lanza to do what he did.
Thank you. Matt?
I've been working at the federal level on the gun debate for 13 years, and I can tell you firsthand that the Connecticut effect, which we heard about this before, isn't fading, it's growing. And the reason it's growing there's two principal reasons for that. One is you have extraordinarily capable leaders in Congress who are not allowing this to die. And second is the families of this tragedy have come together the way no families have ever done before in an instance of a gun massacre. The only parallel is the 9/11 families, and they were stunningly successful. It took some time. It took several Congresses to get 41 different things passed through Congress. They got them all. And the way that the people of Sandy Hook and the people of Connecticut have come together gives me enormous hope that we're going to be able to do all of the kinds of things that we've talked about this morning. So thank you for having me here today. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you. Lynn, I didn't mean to pass you if you had something. Okay. Detective Spell.
If I can't leave you with anything else, it's the mandate for responsibility. Responsibility for the future of our children and the legacies that we will leave them. It is also to look at the deconstruction of this culture of fear that's being whipped up in our country. As I speak to young people in urban areas and ask them, okay, what are you doing with the gun? Fear. I want to feel safe. You ask the criminal, the drug dealer, what were you doing with the gun? I wanted to feel safe. I wanted to be protected from the stick-up boys. We ask the people who have the high-capacity magazines and the assault-style weapons in their home, why do you have the weapon? Well, I want to be ready for Armageddon. I want to be ready in case the government falls apart. There is a culture of fear that's in our country that we're not addressing, and that it's been whipped up, and we're seeing evidence of it in the suburbs, and I've been seeing it in the urban areas for years. Trying to get children to understand that they don't need a weapon to solve their differences. Giving them the tools and the resources so that when they face opposition and meet opposition, that they can handle it without violence. We all have a mandate to do something, and we're past the days of denial and saying that, well, the NRA, they're the victim, they're wrong, and those that want the total removal of weapons, they're wrong. There is a meeting ground, and we have to find it. We have to find it for our children, we have to find it for our grandchildren, and we have to find it for our country. Thanks.
Thank you.
Chris and Lynn, I don't know which is worse, to have lost a parent to gun violence or to lose your child to gun violence. But we shouldn't have to choose between rural and urban. We shouldn't have to choose between sons or parents. I think that this nation, as a nation, has to make a choice. And I think that then when they make that choice, the options are very clear. The options are very clear. So I want to thank our Congresswoman Esty, Congressman Murphy, Senator Murphy, and Senator Blumenthal for your efforts. And let's join together. I plan to go to Washington and work with my other mayors from around the country to make sure that what happened in Sandy Hook never, ever happens again.
What's clear and what's apparent is we have a lot of work to do, and we can't do it alone. We need to work collaboratively together with all our resources, with local, state, and federal government, with state, federal, and local law enforcement. In Connecticut, we're fortunate. We're a relatively small state. Many of my colleagues have personal relationships with the chiefs of police, in particular in this room, and we work very well together. These crimes are not reserved to a border or one location. They cross boundaries, they cross state lines, and we need to seize this opportunity and take this momentum and try to fix this problem. Flight 93 had some words that came out and was, let's roll. Yes. I think we need to fix it, and I think fixing it should be our motto. Let's fix it. Let's stop the violence. Let's change society. Life is different today than it was when I grew up with my parents. And I think we had wholesome TV. We didn't have the violent video games. We didn't have the culture. We didn't have the stimuli that puts poison thoughts in young minds and causes them to disrespect or have no respect for life. And that needs to change. And that's a parental responsibility. And maybe our federal legislators could do some work to stop the violence in the gaming industry. That may have played a part. We don't know. We may never know. But I think that's something we need to look at as well. This has been a great opportunity, and on behalf of Connecticut law enforcement, who I'm representing today, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Captain.
I believe in personal responsibility, and I believe strongly in personal accountability. There was a program in Virginia called Project Exile, and it worked. It basically stated, commit a crime using a gun, and it now fell under a federal jurisdiction. You got a federal sentencing, you went to federal penitentiary. I believe in that. I think that's what we need to do. Again, differentiate those that are law-abiding versus those that are criminal. Let those of us that are conducting our lives in a lawful manner continue to do so, and prosecute and enforce the laws for those that are not. I sincerely appreciate being invited to this forum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists. You've really been excellent. Special thanks to Chris and Lynn McDonald for joining us, to other families who are here today. You give us the kind of strength and courage that you've demonstrated so graphically, and to all of you. If you stand here and look out at this audience, you know, it is truly inspiring. It is an array of Connecticut, you know, the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. This picture is worth 1,000 words. And so I want to thank everyone for being here today. It is a very bipartisan group, truly a bipartisan group, and this cause must be bipartisan. So I want to thank our panelists, all of the others who won't get a chance to speak here. I mentioned earlier that the number of the organizations, Connecticut Against Gun Violence, the Newtown Alliance, Sandy Hook Promise, their voices will truly make a difference. And you're right, Captain, the world is different than when we were children. Looking at your gray hair, I think we may be of similar age. But you know something? The world is different than it was just 2 months ago. The world is different today. And my hope is that the nation has been watching Connecticut because it's seen a lot of strength and community and courage. Pat Lodra, thank you for your leadership over these months. So let's roll. On to the next panel. Thank you.
Let me make one short logistical announcement. It is this. To the extent that anyone wants to grab something to drink or has to go to the bathroom, do it during this panel, because after this panel is finished, this room will essentially be locked down for the Vice President's arrival. And so after this panel finishes, we will then go to the afternoon program, which will include remarks by the Governor, closing remarks by the Senator and myself, and then remarks from the Secretary of Education and the Vice President. But once that afternoon panel begins, this room becomes a secure room. And so if you need to leave the room, know that you have to do it before this panel is finished. Let me thank, first of all, the members of our opening panel on gun law reform. I thought it was a great panel. I thought it did a great job of covering the wide array of changes that are before the federal government, and I really appreciate everyone for taking part. We have a challenge, which is in a very short period of time to try to cover a lot of topics, and so we've included two topics in this second panel which certainly intersect, but sometimes don't, and we're going to have a discussion over the next hour on the issue of both mental health and school safety initiatives. And so let me first introduce our panelists, and then I'll set the table before turning it over to opening remarks. First, we're glad to have with us Dr. Catherine Seifert. Dr. Seifert is the CEO of Eastern Shore Psychological Services. She's worked for over 30 years in the areas of mental health, criminal justice, and addictions. Dr. Seifert has specialized in the assessment and treatment of individuals who are at risk for violence and who are emotionally disturbed. She has lectured nationally on this topic, has written a number of books, including How Children Become Violent and Youth Violence, and she's testified before legislatures and has appeared extensively throughout the country on this very specific issue. Dr. Stephen Girelli. Dr. Stephen Girelli is a licensed clinical psychologist, and he is the president and CEO of Klingberg Family Centers in New Britain, Connecticut. He has worked in the field of child welfare and child mental health for over 25 years. 22 of them have been at Klingberg. Klingberg was founded in 1903. It's a private nonprofit organization. It serves children and family from the greater Hartford area and across Connecticut in an array of behavioral and educational services. He's been on a number of statewide panels looking at assessing gaps and delinquencies within our mental health system. Philip Sun-Eng Wang is with us today from the National Institute of Mental Health, where he is today the acting deputy director. He has spent the majority of his professional career in research, advisory, teaching, and administrative activities, all designed to understand as well as improve the treatment of mental disorders. Currently, he is the acting deputy director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and in that role, he assists the director in overseeing 1,300 NIMH staff and a $1.4 billion budget spent on basic and clinical research into mental illness. Before joining this organization, Dr. Wang served as faculty at Harvard Medical School, and his focus was on the effectiveness of psychotropic medications, where he received grant support from basically every major organization that works in this field. To my left, Dr. George Sagai is the professor at the School of Education at the University of Connecticut. Dr. Sagai is the Carol Neg Endowed Chair at the School of Education. His professional interests include effective classroom and behavior management practices, school-wide discipline, social skills instruction, and positive behavior supports. He has been a classroom teacher, a program director, a camp counselor. Currently, he is co-director of the OSEP Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, and he is director of the UConn Center of Behavioral Education and Research. And finally, my friend Dr. Mark Benigni. Dr. Benigni is currently the superintendent of the Meriden Public School System, and his own doctoral research focused on the role and responsibilities of school resource officers. His research appeared in Principal Leadership, Connecticut Police Chief, and FBI Law Enforcement Bulletins. He is the co-chair of the Connecticut Association of Urban Superintendents and a governing board member for the American Association of School Administrators. Please welcome our panel here today. So let me set the table for our discussion, because as I said, we've got two subjects to cover in this second panel which often intersect, and that is our mental health system, and in particular how we can strengthen it to reach out to adolescents and young adults who may be having thoughts of violence. And second, how do we make our schools safer? How do we make them more positive places that are inclusive of all the students who walk in those doors? In particular, the question on mental health is this: how do we balance our federal budget and 50 state budgets across this country without doing it on the backs of our mental health system? Already, just over the last 4 years of state budget crises, we've seen $4.3 billion taken out of our mental health system, at a time in which state Medicaid systems are reporting a 10% increase in the demand on those mental health systems. That stat is layered on top of what we already know, that in particular for children, only about 20% of children who have a serious mental illness are receiving treatment. The number is slightly better for adults who have a slightly better rate of diagnosis. 4,000 inpatient psychiatric beds have been closed in the last 4 years alone across this country. And so we're asking this question: how do we balance our federal and state budgets without doing it on the backs of the mental health system? Of course, we've already answered that question, that we have been doing it. And so as we try to figure out, in response to the horrific incidents of Newtown and Aurora and Tucson, how we make sure that children and young adults who are seriously psychologically ill, who may have a predilection towards violence, we're at a crisis moment, because it's not clear whether we're going to have the resources to do outreach to families and to individuals who want to seek help before that moment of destruction comes. But the corresponding question on that side of the ledger is, how do we do this without furthering an already debilitating stigma about mental illness? The NRA came out and said that their solution is to have this nation invest in a national registry of everybody with mental illness. What we know is that if we take steps here to further stigmatize mental illness by equating it with violence, then we make it harder and harder for people who want to seek help to do so. There is no inherent connection between mental illness and violence. In fact, someone who is mentally ill is much more likely to be the subject of violence than to be the perpetrator of violence. And yet we know that the people that took on these crimes had deep psychological disabilities that were not treated. And so it's a balancing act, and a tough question that I'll ask our panelists to talk about. How do we make sure that our mental health system gets to these kids and to these young adults before they commit these awful crimes without increasing a stigma that makes it harder for families and individuals to go out and seek treatment? And that's the same question on the school safety side as well. How do we make our schools safer places without militarizing our schools? How do we give teachers and educators a sense of security that in a lot of schools throughout Connecticut they do not have today without making them armed camps? And so we're going to talk today about the variety of ways in which you can do that. To the extent that we are talking about more school resource officers, what's the right way to invest in that kind of safety mechanism? And what are the broader discussions that we have to make and that we have to create positive school environments in which kids aren't pushed out and don't have these very destructive feelings about the places that they came from that cause them to return to do this kind of damage? What can we do to improve school climate so that we create more inclusive environments that don't push kids out and don't push kids and young adults to these thoughts? These aren't easy questions, and they're certainly not going to be solved in the course of a 40-minute discussion, but just as important as a conversation about gun laws is a conversation about improving our mental health system, especially for at-risk youth that have this dangerous and toxic combination of mental illness and predilection to violence, and how do we make our schools safer places so that, first and foremost, something like Newtown never happens again, but second, so that teachers and administrators and students who right now are in a lot of systems throughout Connecticut living with some modicum of fear have that fear taken away. With that, let me turn this over to the panel, and we'll go down the line and we'll ask Dr. Seifert to start off. Same ground rules. You've all got a few minutes for opening remarks, and then we'll have a conversation in which we ask people to react to each other. Dr. Seifert.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank everybody for being here for such an important issue. And as the previous panel said, I think it's important that we all find common ground where we can agree and build a coalition that can get something done. So paraphrasing in the words of the sometimes famous philosopher from the Sunday comics, Pogo, we have seen the person with the solution, and he is us. The U.S. is more violent and incarcerates more people than any other industrialized country in the world. These numbers suggest that a reactive approach to dealing with violence is ineffective. We must become more proactive and shift our focus to violence prevention. It's not an easy task, but by increasing awareness of mental illness and violence and strengthening the skills and capacity of individuals, families, communities, we can create a safer country in which our children can grow up and be safe. Mental illness and violence are two separate constructs. They are very different phenomena. Not everybody that's mentally ill is violent, and not everybody that's violent is mentally ill. But one can contribute to the other. It is estimated that mental illness affects 25% of the U.S. population. However, 3 to 5 out of every 100,000 people in the United States perpetrates gun-related violence. So they really are two separate groups. There are at least two major groups of violent offenders, those with chronic lifelong violence, and those are more often found in the urban areas, and those with one major heinous act involving multiple victims, more commonly found in rural areas. The characteristics of the two groups differ. There is no single factor that will predict whether a person will become violent or not, and the treatment and interventions for these two groups are also different. It is the perfect storm of psychological, environmental, trauma, learning, and developmental factors that come together to erupt in violence. No one thing, like mental illness, is the trigger. It's multiple things. So factors associated with violence in the chronic violent group are history of childhood abuse, neglect, exposure to domestic violence, past violent behavior, chronic school and work problems, the combination of mental illness and substance abuse without receiving treatment, poverty, obsession with violence, lack of resources to cope with the problems they have, and neighborhoods with high crime areas. Factors associated with the second group, the single act, heinous act with multiple victims, lack of social skills, violent communications, severe school and job difficulties, obsession with violence, psychosis or autism, and unavailability of non-stigmatizing treatment. When multiple risk factors exist and they outweigh the protective factors, such as a resilient temperament or a relationship with a supportive pro-social adult, the individual can be predisposed to violent behavior. These are the signs that we need to pay attention to, particularly during childhood and adolescence. The earlier we can be aware of the warning signs, provide treatment, and increase resiliency, the greater chance we have at preventing violence. Prevention works, and it is cost effective. For every dollar that you spend on prevention, you're going to save anywhere from $10 to $250 in treatment at the far end, or in tragedies that cost millions of dollars and lots of heartache. Assessment and research is available to determine which kids are at higher risk, decide how severe their impairment is, and to determine what interventions need to be in place in order to help them grow up to be healthy individuals. The solution lies in making these services as universally available as possible, and we will save money in the long run. It's up to us to make the next generation of children grow up in a safe environment. From a personal point of view, this means understanding early childhood development, acting on that knowledge, and providing a caring and safe environment for kids. From a civic point of view, this means fighting to make sure the right programs are in place for all children, and to be sure that children are in stable, healthy, and enriched environments. Armed with additional information and inspiration, it is time for all adults to do their part in reversing the trends of gun violence and disposing of mental illness stigma that is pervasive throughout our society. Starting with today's children, it's time to stop the cycle.
Good morning. We at NIMH would first like to extend our heartfelt condolences to the victims, the families of this unthinkable tragedy. We'd also like to thank Senators Blumenthal, Senators Murphy, and Representative Esty for the opportunity to participate in this very important conference and share what we've learned through research about both mental illness and violence. Mental illness is remarkable for three things. One is it's very common. There's virtually no family that hasn't been affected by it, and that's because, as you heard, it affects 1 out of 5 individuals in this country each year. And it's also remarkable for its disabling quality. It affects 1 in 20 people so seriously that they can't function. Another remarkable feature of mental disorders is that it strikes the young. Half of mental illnesses begin before the age of 14, and by the age of 24, 3/4 of mental illnesses have occurred. It's important to point out, as you've heard actually now from Senator Murphy and Dr. Seifert, most people with mental illness aren't violent. And it's critically important to keep in mind that most acts of violence, only about 3 to 5% are actually attributable to those with serious mental illness. It's important to also realize that the seriously mentally ill, when they do commit acts of violence, it's much more likely to be towards themselves than it is towards others. And this is illustrated by data on the numbers that commit suicide. Among those with serious mental illness, 1 in 20 will ultimately end their lives via suicide. 1 in 600 will commit homicide if they're untreated. The issue, I think, is facing all of us is how do you predict who among those with serious mental illness are ultimately going to commit acts of violence and commit them direct them towards others. And it's been notoriously difficult. It's difficult for researchers to predict. It's difficult for clinicians to predict because of all the multiple risk factors which operate in very complex ways and in very complex combinations. One actionable risk factor, though, is being untreated for psychosis. And by psychosis, what I mean is when an individual with serious mental illness loses touch with reality. They start experiencing things like hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that aren't there, delusions, believing things that aren't reality-based, or becoming very, very paranoid. This psychosis, if untreated, does increase the risk of violence and violence towards others. But data have also shown that if you treat psychosis, you can reduce the risk of violence to that of someone who doesn't have serious mental illness. So this is one way to potentially intervene and decrease risk for violence, and that is increasing earlier detection and increasing earlier intervention. Those with serious mental illness currently, when they are in a first episode, in other words, first experiencing these signs and symptoms, delusions, hallucinations, loss of reality, they wait typically over 100 weeks. That's 2 years without any treatment. And meanwhile, treatment would decrease their risk of violence by 15-fold, and again, help reduce it to that of what someone without mental illness would have in terms of risk for violence. So this is an important, we think, component of a strategy for decreasing risk of violence in the future, and that is decreasing this duration, this length of time that individuals with serious mental illness remain untreated. Towards that end, we continue to support research that is looking for ways to detect people with serious mental illness earlier, ways to intervene before either full-blown symptoms occur, ideally even before someone at risk develops some early symptoms. We also hope to work and inform the efforts of SAMHSA, which is currently trying to stand up a number of programs that the White House has asked for to increase awareness of mental illness and also to increase its detection and effective treatment.
Good morning. I'm speaking today at the request of my friend and colleague, Nelba Marquez Green. Nelba is the coordinator of the Family Therapy Institute, a joint program of Klingberg Family Centers and Central Connecticut State University. Nelba's precious daughter, Anna, was killed at Sandy Hook on December 14th. Let me again and publicly offer my condolences to Nelba and her family, and my condolences to the other 25 families who lost loved ones on that day, and to those youth and families who face the threat of gun violence on a daily basis, especially in our urban communities. I hope to bring to this discussion a perspective born of working with troubled youth, many of whose lives have been impacted by hostile surroundings, poverty, heart-wrenching traumas, and multi-generational struggles. I have seen the resilience of such youth and families in my work at Klingberg Family Centers. With skillful support, they can become successful, happy, productive members of our communities. I applaud the fact that the national debate about gun violence has been expanded to include the importance of improving our mental health delivery system for children and families. But I also offer a cautionary note, and I'm not the first one offering it, clearly. In the wake of Sandy Hook, I worry that we will demonize those who suffer from mental illness. I hear stories from parents who fear for the acceptance and well-being of their children who may be viewed as prone to violence by virtue of their mental illness. In fact, the vast majority of those we serve are at no greater risk for violence than those of us in this room. I urge that in our striving to solve the national gun violence crisis, we do not make the mistake of seeing demons in every mental health clinic, psychiatric bed, and special education classroom. To do so would only create of them a different kind of victim. Let me tell you a bit about the youth we serve at Klingberg Family Centers who are at the greatest risk for long-term debilitating mental illness and in some cases violent outcomes. The vast majority are those who have been emotionally disconnected from family and community, disenfranchised and marginalized in their relationships. They are the ones who exist on the social fringes, often passing through schools unnoticed. Many of the youth we serve also have suffered significant trauma, the aftermath of which leaves them anxious, depressed, distrusting, and overwhelmed. The combination of trauma and social isolation is a particularly toxic mixture because the antidote for the long-term effects of trauma is found within the context of healthy relationships. In view of these observations, I offer some suggestions. First, early identification of those children at risk, either by virtue of their trauma experiences or socially isolating circumstances, is critical. Schools, daycare settings, pediatricians, clergy, and health clinics have been at the vanguard of identifying at-risk children. But they need better training, greater coordination, and more resources available for children whom they identify at risk. It is vitally important that all professionals working with children and youth have well-developed skills in identifying trauma symptoms. We also need to make our mental health services more inviting to families. Many parents are wary about seeking services for their children for a variety of reasons, including social stigma, fear that seeking services might lead to accusations of abuse and neglect, and their own sometimes troublesome encounters with the system. Other obstacles include access issues related to cost, geography, transportation, and long waiting lists. Federal resources should be dedicated to improving service accessibility and to promoting among practitioners the use of well-developed family engagement strategies. In fact, these very same family engagement skills are critical in all of our interactions with families, whether they be in our schools, churches, courtrooms, or communities. In social and mental health services, we need to continue to broaden our focus from the individual child to the entire family, often the extended family. And we need to ensure that mental health professionals are highly skilled in trauma treatment. Federal funds to promote broader access to training in family therapy and in trauma care are critical. In order to adequately address the needs of disenfranchised and traumatized youth, we need to strengthen families through expansion of community resources. For example, we need to offer training and parenting skills to families whose own upbringing left them ill-equipped to be effective parents. We need to increase fatherhood initiatives to improve the role of young fathers who often were disconnected from their own fathers. We need schools whose functions go beyond traditional education to engage the entire family, including more school-based clinics that can address mental health as well as physical health needs. And we need to promote integration among all of the systems and individuals who interface with the families of children at risk. All of these improvements would benefit from effective national policy and targeted funding. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to present some content for you to think about. It's really quite an honor to be here. I'm very humbled. I'm very motivated by the topics, the people that are in this room. My appreciation and respect goes to all of you in this room who've experienced violence directly or indirectly. It really has pushed us to thinking about what kind of commitment we truly want to make on this topic. And I want to really ask all of us to think about taking on this topic and head on and with the passion that you're all expressing inside this room. As a context for my remarks, I would like to be able to tell you that I am at the University of Connecticut, and what I have the really fortunate opportunity to be able to do is work with educators in schools, principals, teachers, school psychologists, social workers, secretaries, custodians, and so forth. And I want to argue that they're one of our best resources for dealing with some of the challenges that you all are addressing inside this room. They are one component of it, but I believe they are an important part, and I'll try to explain to you why I believe that. My area of interest are around school-based mental health, positive school culture, making sure that schools are safe places for parents, kids, staff members, and others to feel comfortable in being able to learn about the skills they need to be successful citizens, but also to be able to communicate with each other about their concerns, their celebrations and accomplishments, and things that they hear and so forth. I'm very concerned about kids that have been discussed already who have behavioral challenges, who have risk factors that decrease their likelihood of succeeding at school. I'm very interested in looking at how we increase the opportunities for kids who have disabilities in our schools so they can be contributing citizens as well. And I want us to think about all kids as being important to us to think about as we deal with this topic around school violence and so forth. I'd also like you to think about school violence beyond what we've been talking about primarily here in this room. Yes, the gun violence is significant, but there are also other kinds of violence that occurs in our schools, in our homes, in our communities that are related to some of the solutions and suggestions that were given here today. As a little bit of a background and a little bit of context for what I'm going to present to you, I'm married. I'm married to a school principal. She teaches in Wyndham Public Schools. She's a phenomenal principal, and she's probably the person I go to first for all the research and theory that I put forward. She's my vetting. She's my check to make sure that I'm grounded. I have two kids. They've been through the public school system. They are also two people that I go to, two kids that I go to check on what I'm going to present to you today. It's amazing how kids can tell you what can work and won't work with respect to being a researcher and a teacher preparer. I mention my family because the topics that we're addressing today are significant to myself and my family, as well as to the families and others inside this room. School violence, school-based behavioral health, building social competence is significant for us, and it's something that we all have an investment in. I'm hoping that we can try to address this as a group. So in the few minutes that I have left, I'd like to make sure that we walk away with two big ideas. And one of those is that safe, preventative, nonviolent schools are a significant investment for us. They serve as a comprehensive preventive response. They're really important because there's schools in every neighborhood. Every family knows about schools. Every community knows that schools exist in their neighborhood and go to them when they need access to different kinds of resources. They're more common than most anything else we have, other than churches and some other kinds of social structures out there. However, to make those work for us, we do have to take a balanced approach that looks at all the topics that have been covered today. Also, that we facilitate friendly opportunities for communication. If there's not an open means for communication, we're not going to be able to share our successes as well as our concerns, and maybe be able to prevent some of the things that we are discussing today. I'd also like to suggest to you, under this first big idea of preventative schools, is that we really do need to build relationships with ourselves, with our kids, with our colleagues, and so forth, that are friendly and functional. If we don't have a means for communication, we're not going to have the ability to communicate the kinds of things that are being discussed at this conference. The second big idea I want you to think about, though, is that these communications, this connectedness that I've described for you, isn't going to be possible if we don't have these relationships that have been established. We're not going to be able to prevent, we're not going to be able to respond, we're not going to be able to come up with supports to try to deal with these challenges. So I wanted to think about the relationship between communication, interpersonal relationships, and our ability to prevent some of the things that are being described. An important study that you should know about occurred in the year 2002 by the U.S. Secret Service and the Department of Ed. And in that particular study, what they found is that in most violent acts that occurred at school, somebody knew about the act before it occurred. In 80% of those acts that they were studied, at least one person knew what the person who was perpetrating the act was going to do or thinking about doing. In 60% of those incidences, more than one person knew about the incident before it occurred and knew about what the attack was going to look like. It's so important that if somebody knows about what might happen, that they have the means, the trust, and the opportunity to share that information. I'm looking at it from a different perspective than what the first panel dealt with, which is that prevention perspective. And if you know, we can act. If you know, you're able to intervene before. And I really want to suggest that the school is a place to invest in that activity. One of the tricks becomes one of how do you establish those kinds of environments? And I want to suggest to you that the best way to create those environments, as a school person myself, is to maximize kids' academic and social success at school. Schools have to be perceived as a welcoming place for kids and parents and staff members. If they are welcoming, if they are positive, we have a chance for communications to occur, and kids will trust us to be able to tell us what they know and be able to say things that they're worried about and things that we can act upon. I want to suggest to you that classroom settings are important, but we also have non-classroom settings that are also significant. We have sporting events, we have assemblies, we have field trips, we have hallways, we have cafeterias, all of which need to be attended to as we think about creating these environments for communications to occur. The last piece I want to suggest to you around this topic is that our kids that we are investing in for the future actually have to be taught the skills to be able to navigate our schools and our neighborhoods and our communities. They need to be taught about what problem solving looks like, how to manage conflicts in a way that is satisfying to all players, and to also know how to ask for help in a way that's safe, non-threatening, and stigmatizing. If we don't create the opportunity for those things to occur, it's going to be very difficult to try to address the prevention science that many of us are trying to focus on up here. So to finish off, I'd like to remind us that it isn't a balanced approach. It's one in which we really need to think about prevention in the context of how we can formally create these particular environments. Prevention is not something that happens by chance. It does not happen informally. It's something that occurs in a formalized attempt for all of us to engage in. I'd like to suggest that all of us can actually do something tomorrow in trying to address the challenge. We can't wait for policy, always. We can't wait for procedures to be put in place and safeguards. One of the best things you can do is hug your kids. One of the best things you can do is actively supervise what they're doing. One of the best things you can do is on a daily basis let your kids know that you value and appreciate what they are doing and the relationship you have. The more investment we have in those kinds of real activities you can do on a daily basis, the greater the likelihood that you're going to have the opportunity to share communications with each other and your children, and the greater the opportunity you're going to have to be able to intervene before some of these significant issues or activities or incidents are likely to occur. I'm kind of focusing on one part of the comprehensive challenge. I really believe it is a much broader challenge than what I'm presenting, but I really would like you to think about how schools are an important resource for addressing this. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to share with you. I know that many of you in this room are highly motivated to engage in this activity, and I'm really hoping that you have a chance to kind of walk away with some things you can do tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murphy, Senator Blumenthal, Congresswoman Esty, for organizing this important conversation. I'm honored to be here. A special thank you to all of you for being here today. My heart goes out to the Newtown families and community, and all the communities who have been devastated by school and neighborhood violence. There is nothing more important than all of us working together to keep our students, our children safe. Not a test, not a program, not a ranking. As a father of two, Bria, a 6-year-old first grader, and Blake, a 5-year-old kindergartner, I'm reminded every day that parents send their children to our schools expecting that they will be safe, both physically and emotionally. My wife, Amy, is a 2nd grade teacher, and we both appreciate all that our children's school does to challenge them with rigorous coursework. But we are equally thankful and appreciative of how the school lets them know how much they care about them. Whether it is the principal calling them down to read, the PBIS incentives, the Student of the Month awards, or just the smiling supportive staff, Bria and Blake know that school is a safe place. So what can we do to keep our promise to Bria, Blake, and to all the students that attend our schools? While it may start with uniform crisis plans, all schools can test their current safety procedures and protocols, train their staff, students, and community on appropriate safety measures, team up with local law enforcement, community organizations, and families. tell Congress and our leaders that we need funding for security and mental health support. Take action, don't wait. Make changes in your building, talk with staff and students, communicate with families, and open your doors to the police and other community organizations. Our objective is simple: to strike a balance between physical and emotional security in a welcoming, nurturing school environment. Sensible security. Each school district must decide how best to meet that objective. In Meriden, we are attempting to meet this objective through facility upgrades, additional student service personnel, and school resource officers and police support. Our facility upgrades include buzz-in entry system, cameras, keyless entry systems, all rooms numbered and lockable. Our student service personnel enhancements include, and we're not backing away from this, as we continue to face immense budget pressures, the first thing that we seem to cut are the social workers, the psychologists, all the mental health support that we know our students need. We hear about study after study about class size, but it's time for us to recognize that our students are more than just a class size issue. So our student service personnel enhancements have included an increase in social workers, psychologists, board-certified behavior analysts, and behavior technicians. We also have developed partnerships with the Community Health Center to add additional resources and support to our schools. Our police partnerships include school resource officers in all of our middle and high schools, DARE programs in our elementary schools. We want our elementary students to see the police in their buildings. We do not have full school resource officer programs at the elementary level. We also worked with our local police department to audit all of our school buildings and make recommendations. The unique role of our SROs make them a great resource at the secondary school level, not just because of the law enforcement component, that I think we all know, but because of the law-related teaching and law-related counseling components. I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you again for all you do for our students and our communities.
Well, thank you again to our panelists. I apologize for my scratchiness in my voice. Let me take just a slight bit of personal privilege here. First, thank you very much, Stephen, for recognizing Nelba's role in this conference. Nelba has been one of these heroic voices who has spoken out on the need for a balanced approach to mental health investment, and we had asked her to be on this panel, and she deferred to her boss. And so we're glad that you're here. There are so many elected officials in the audience today that we couldn't list them all, but let me just give recognition to my colleague, Congressman Jim Himes, who's joined us today. Jim, thank you very much for joining us. And lastly, let me just say that we, a lot of us are lucky to have members of our immediate family that we rely on greatly for expertise in this subject. My wife, Kathy Hollihan, is here today, who's the director of Connecticut Legal Services Children at Risk Unit. She's helping to lead with her colleagues this effort to make our schools a safer place, and I'm glad that she's here. So I have a million topics that I want to talk about, so let me try to run through these as quickly as I can. Let's talk about a broad one first, which I think intersects both sides of the podium here, and that's this issue that a couple people have brought up about learned behavior versus innate behavior. One of the things that I heard about last night, I was in New Haven, Connecticut, meeting with about 40 middle school and high school kids in inner city New Haven, and what they talked about was that kids in that city are so quick to resort to violence in order to resolve disputes because they haven't been taught, whether it be at home or in the school system, a different way to resolve their problems. And as we try to intersect this conversation between incidences of horrific mass violence, but also trying to cut down on the unfortunate everyday gun violence that happens in our city, much of it is just connected to this idea that I think we're talking about with regard to teaching a different way of conflict resolution. I mean, that would help throughout the spectrum. But let's start with that topic, because you've all touched on it a little bit. What can we do better in our school systems, in consultation with parents, to try to teach different ways of resolving disputes so that people don't go and reach for a gun in New Haven or Hartford or Sandy Hook? It's a big topic, but Dr. Segal, you want to take the first crack at it?
I've had two thoughts come to mind around that kind of a question. One is I think it's really important for people to understand that punishment as a consequence for problem behavior is insufficient by itself, mainly because it doesn't teach a better way of solving the problem, solving the conflict, solving the issue in the future. It's really important to keep that in mind because in our school context, what we find is that kids who are having the most significant challenges are typically the ones who are least responsive to the consequences we have in place. And what we end up doing is we give them more of the same as a way to convince them to change what they're doing. And what we actually end up with is what we've learned from the mental health world is the more punishers kids receive, the more challenges, more risk factors that come into their life. And it makes it much more difficult for them to be successful. I would like us to think about social behavior in the same way we think about academic behavior. If a kid misspells a word, we don't send them to the office. We reteach. If a kid has difficulty with a math problem, we reteach the math. If a kid makes a social behavior error, uses his fist to manage anger, we don't send him to the, we really should be stepping back and saying, what do we want to teach that kid to do instead? We need to teach alternative responses, either on the street or in the school. We don't emphasize the alternatives. What's really important for us to remember, it doesn't matter if it's innate or learned, behavior works for a lot of us. It works. And as long as it works, we continue to use it. And we'll use it until we have an alternative that works better. There's a great sign on a fast food driving marquee. It says, scream until your daddy stops the car. And kids have learned that screaming works really well because when you stop and feed the kid, screaming stops. But the problem is you go three blocks down and now you have the golden arches. And what does the kid do? Scream again because it's worked in the past. It's a kind of weird analogy, but if you spin that over to the violent behavior side, it is satisfying to manage your anger by hitting, biting, scratching, and so forth. It is satisfying to get the other kid to stay away. But it's not the right way to solve the problem. And I want to argue that we should be teaching our kids social skills that allow them to be successful in difficult situations in the same way we're teaching kids to read, do calculus, and do math.
I agree with all of that. I would add that not only teaching kids the skills that they need to negotiate relationships and especially conflict, but teaching kids all kinds of skills so that they develop a sense of mastery, because oftentimes what happens is when kids, especially younger kids, but really across the age range, resort to violence, it is not infrequently an expression of a sense of powerlessness or lack of mastery. This is a bit cliched, but low self-esteem, and the more we can do in our schools and elsewhere to develop within kids mastery and empowerment, the less they will resort to violence as a way of getting needs met, I think.
Dr. Seifert?
Excellent answers. And I want to add to that is that some parts of violence are also a learned behavior. And so we need to reach out to the families and the communities where children are learning that violence is a way to get your needs met. And so if we teach them social skills in school, but they're going home and parents are still using their fist, or those in the community are still using their fist, they have models that are counteracting what we're trying to do in the schools. So it needs to be a broader intervention across the board.
So this then spins me into the next topic that we should talk about in this panel. One of the ways in which you learn behavior is from popular culture. And there is a lot of evidence surrounding the incident in Newtown, as well as many of these other incidences of young male adults perpetrating acts of mass violence, that they had some pretty massive exposure to violent media, in particular violent video games. We've also heard that there's not a lot of definitive evidence to suggest that there is a direct link. Can we talk about this for a second? This is maybe not directly relevant to federal legislation, but there's certainly a lot of federal pressure that can be applied to try to change the relationship between the makers of that media and children and young adults. Dr. Seifert, I'll turn it right back to you because I know you've done research on this.
There are a couple things that we do know based on the research. That number one, violent media affect kids who are already vulnerable more than it affects kids who are living in a stable household. I want to add to that, you want to limit the amount of violent media that children at younger ages get. I would say you don't want them to have any violent media, but it needs to be supervised. Parents need to choose carefully what children have access to, and the amount of time that they spend on violent media without having discussions with parents about the other side of moral duties and the laws of society and how to behave. And children who are vulnerable should have no access to violent media.
Other thoughts on this? Dr. Wang, what do we know in terms of research on this issue?
We know less than we like. I think, and that part of the White House call for new research is actually into this area. You know, what is the impact of exposure to violent media, images, video games? We don't know much. I think one thing we probably suspect, because I appreciate your suggestion that these are broad issues, and I think that's the one thing we've learned about some of these tragedies, these conditions. I think we'd all like to think there's a single problem with a single answer, and I think what we have found, actually, this is something we found just in when you look across the spectrum of disorders or conditions, they often break down into multiple problems, each of which has a broad set of risk, maybe resilience factors that work kind of in concert. And the interventions that look like they work often for these kinds of conditions are multiple interventions, often packaged together to take care of these multiple problems, and each having a sort of set of components to take care of the many risk factors that probably contribute. Again, not saying a single one. So I think so I don't have any answers. I just really questions at this point. But the thing we've learned from research on this is it's probably going to take a broad view of both the contributors and then a broad view of how to intervene.
Let me keep it on this side, but this will intersect across the conversation. The first panel talked a lot about background checks and talked about what individuals should be prohibited from owning weapons. And there was a suggestion that the system doesn't work very well today for two reasons. One, there's not enough reporting into the system, and two, we might be drawing the line in the wrong place. So let me ask that question. Where should we be drawing the line in terms of diagnoses or adjudications with respect to people with mental illness as to who should own a gun and who shouldn't? Because you've accurately said that there is not necessarily an inherent connection between the two, so it doesn't make sense that everyone with any diagnosis should be prohibited from owning a gun, but maybe we're not drawing that line in the right place.
That's
you'll go.
Yeah,
you're
pointing to me. That's sort of the third rail for a mental health practitioner. I mean, it's very, very difficult because, as was pointed out, the predictors for violence are complicated, they're interactive, and I think the risk of us seeing every person with a mental illness as a likely source of violence is risky. At the same time, I think looking at what research there is and expanding upon what research there is regarding what are good predictors of violence and incorporating those into decisions about who has access to firearms and who doesn't is meaningful. But still balancing the issues that you yourself raised in the opening about the social stigma that already exists in the area of mental health and the risk of increasing that when we talk about such things as registries and things like that. But I think anything we do has to be very, very empirically informed because it is such a complex area.
Other thoughts? Dr. Seaver?
You point to me. As I said earlier, mental illness and violence are two separate issues. So if we're going to draw a line about which mentally ill people are going to be allowed to have guns and which ones aren't, we're either going to draw the line too broadly and include too many people, or we're going to draw the line too narrowly and we're going to miss people. So because it's a complex issue, it's difficult to draw the line. Here's part of the problem. The ones that are most likely to be dangerous, that have a mental illness, are not in treatment. And they're not on anybody's radar screen, and they're not on anybody's list. And they're not being reported. So the ones in treatment are less likely to be violent. It's when they get out in the community and are not in treatment, that's where we have difficulties, and there's no way to report them.
Senator. Sure. From a practical school standpoint, we're all launching school climate surveys, and with our climate survey, there's some trigger questions. So if a student answers that question and it's a concerning answer, well, then it triggers an email right away to the school social worker, the psychologist, the principal, to central office, and then we're able to know that we have an issue and get immediate attention. We're also working with the University of Connecticut on the same school climate survey where it could be a predictor of future behavior problems. So let's prevent the problems before they occur. But both of those mechanisms are promising and something that schools can do now to be helpful and supportive of these issues.
Let me ask one more specific question on this topic, which is one of the things we heard in the first panel, is that today there are much less involuntary commitments than there may have been in the past. And I'm asking this without knowing the answer myself, should a new line be institutional commitment regardless of the way you get there, or is that too broad a category to create?
I think that's too broad. I think the other issue is that there have been, and you are probably in a better position to comment on this than I, but that there have been dramatic trends away from the use of inpatient treatment for mental illness toward more community-based treatments. So if the threshold becomes an inpatient stay, whether through commitment or through voluntary action on the part of the patient, that misses a great number of people who either are not seeking treatment or are receiving their treatment in some other place besides the inpatient setting, many perhaps in prisons.
We've got about 10 minutes, so I want to cover just two more topics. I want to talk about SROs for just a little bit longer. I want to talk about the concern that a lot of people have that by putting more SROs, which are a fancier way to say police officers, in our schools, that we create a different kind of culture than we're trying to create, and you start to criminalize behavior that shouldn't be criminalized. And then there's the right way to do SROs, or the right way to put more personnel that might be more appropriate, like school counselors, that might have a greater impact than a school resource officer. So maybe would like Dr. Benigni and Tsegay to talk a little bit about your thoughts on SROs and perhaps the dangers of doing it wrong.
You know, I'm a strong supporter of SROs at the secondary school level, at the middle and high schools. I think where the law-related counseling and law-related teaching aspect of the job becomes more valuable, I think it makes sense to have that person there. My concern would be using limited resources to put a school resource officer in every elementary school. I'm not so sure the law-related counseling and law-related topics are as significant at the elementary level. I think having a police presence in your elementary school through DARE programs or through other support programs makes sense, but to use limited resources to add additional school resource officers at the elementary level would not be something that we would be interested in doing as a city. To add additional mental health support in our elementary schools, to do increased family outreach at our elementary school level would be things that I think would be helpful.
What's your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, I would just add three things to that comment. I mean, it's right on about thinking about when's the best place and the best time. If you have an SRO, I'm going to jump ahead to that question, that part of the question. I think it's really important that there be clear communications about the roles and responsibilities of those individuals so that teachers, parents, kids, and SROs know how they're interacting with each other, that they are there for a particular purpose, but they also can be an asset in another way in the sense of creating more positive school climates. One thing we've learned, it's really important to include SROs in our disciplined school-based positive school climate work, because they need to learn about how we're trying to create preventative, positive classroom environments so they can participate in that and also understand the context in which their job is being located. I also think it's important that we give SROs, if you will, the opportunity to have positive interactions with kids, parents, and staff. Because without the positive interactions and the relationships being established, it's unlikely that a kid's going to go to an SRO and say, I heard about, I want to tell you this. You've got to have a relationship with the people you're communicating with if you want that communication to have value and to have an effect on preventing something in the future. So it is really important that if you have an SRO and see the need for it, they become part of the climate and culture of that school. You're clear about the relationships and how you're interacting with each other. And thirdly, that you give the SRO folks an opportunity to know about how they can participate in creating and supporting that positive climate.
Great. We are at the end of our time, so let me just ask for 1 minute worth of final thoughts that maybe haven't been added here. Start with you, Dr. Seifert.
The Healthy Families program that assists new mothers and fathers with developmental information in their homes is a very good prevention option, and it's very cost effective, and it's been shown to reduce criminality and violence as the children grow older.
NIMH is pursuing research to help us get there earlier in 3 ways. One is, if you already have a diagnosis, if it's already occurred, can we get you treatment earlier? Because again, we know it reduces your risk of violence if you have serious mental illness to that of someone who doesn't have serious mental illness. Can we, if you are beginning to experience the warning signs of, say, psychosis, can we get there early enough to prevent you from transitioning into full-blown psychosis and avert, again, this risk? But really, what we really hope to do is find out what are these risks, risk resilience factors, what causes serious mental illness? Can we intervene and preempt the serious mental illness from ever occurring in the first place?
I like that we're doing action steps here. That's a good way to end. So, Dr. Girelli.
I would just build on what was said about schools. As I indicated earlier, I think schools play a central role in identifying and in helping kids who are either have mental illness or are at risk for mental illness. And I also think having law enforcement as a prominent part of schools and embedded in the culture of schools, as opposed to standing at the front door as sort of guardian of the schools, is really important. And that part of that is that the psychological safety in schools is critical to the well-being of the students, and also, as was said earlier, critical to students feeling safe to have someone to go to say, I'm concerned about what I just heard and I'd like some help with it.
Final action steps.
I'm an optimist, and I really believe that we can create civil societies, civil cultures, civil neighborhoods. And I would really urge you all to think about how you can contribute to creating a positive interaction with somebody out there on the street, in your home, or in your school. I really do believe that if our only approach is to be reactive and set policy, we're not going to get very far the fast way. And that we as individuals actively can do something tomorrow, today, in trying to change the interactions we have with each other. I know that there are kids inside of schools who tell me, I can't remember the last time an adult has said my name. I can't remember the last time an adult has acknowledged me for something I've done well. And if that's the kind of relationships that adults have with kids, we're not going to have the ability to communicate with each other. We're not going to be able to learn about kids who have risks or protective factors that need strengthening and so forth. So I'd really ask you to think about what can you do tomorrow with your spouse, your spouse, your colleagues, your kids, your teachers, your whatever. We're not a very civil society right now in how we're interacting with each other. We're butting heads. We're concerned about kids doing bullying behavior. In fact, we are bullying ourselves. So I really encourage you to think about our own personal behavior in the process. So good job, everybody.
Yes, as we continue to focus on improved student achievement, we also need to value the climate and culture of our schools. We need to create schools that students and staff want to be at every day. And if we don't do that, we're going to be shortchanging our students.
Great. Well, Listen, there's a dozen other topics that we could have covered here, but this whets our appetites to give us a sense of, listen, both the direction we have to head, but also some outstanding, complicated questions that we still have to wrestle with in a short period of time. Thank you to this panel. As I mentioned, we're going to need everybody to stay in your seats. We are going to begin our afternoon program at this point, awaiting the arrival of Secretary Duncan and the Vice President. And as we transition to the afternoon setup, another round of applause for both of our morning panels.
I am Mark Boughton, Mayor of the City of Danbury. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for your passion and interest in this very challenging issue that confronts all of us. I'm here today also to welcome, obviously, our governor, his staff, and all of the terrific elected officials that have taken an interest in this issue. Obviously, I'm here also to welcome, on behalf of all the residents of the City of Danbury, our Vice President, and we applaud and thank him for coming here today to share with us some thoughts and ideas about a path forward for all of us after December 14th. On behalf of all the elected officials that are here, I also want to thank them for coming, and I want to recognize them. I don't have all their names, but there are a lot of folks here who are mayors and first selectmen and Board of Ed members and chairpersons of the Board of Ed, and we thank them and honor them for their commitment to this issue as well. Of course, there can be no better local elected official than First Selectman Patricia Lodrin, who has demonstrated through her courage, her compassion, and her sense of leadership about how a community can deal with a very, very difficult and tragic situation. And so I'm proud to call her my friend and proud to be associated with all of the hard work that she will have to do in the many years to come. As she told me last week, this is not a one-year project, a two-year project. This is a decades-long project to help Newtown heal after those events. And it will take all of our strength and all of our courage in this room. And it's not a one-year project to get legislation passed that will help make our children safer. It will be a decades-long battle of incremental change that we seek to bring today. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for your interest. And of course, I'd like to thank the Vice President of the United States for being here. It's now my pleasure and honor to bring back to the stage my good friend, Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty.
Thank you, Mayor Boughton. And before I introduce our next speaker, I want to express my gratitude to Secretary Duncan, to Vice President Biden, and to the support and care that the administration and the President have shown by sending them here today, underscoring the deep commitment to making real, meaningful change in our communities to save lives in the wake of the Newtown tragedy. Today's discussion is a reminder that even in the face of great difficulty, we must not lose our will to move forward with common sense reforms to end and reduce and hopefully end gun violence. And for me, today is a reminder of why I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful for the future, that we can achieve meaningful change in the face of unimaginable tragedy. I'm hopeful because of everyday Americans, not just in this room, but across this great country, who are making their voices heard on this issue. I'm hopeful because of the extraordinary people I've gotten to know, the first responders, the courageous teachers and custodians, because of these amazing parents, because of the survivor parents who are also with us today, the 12 children who escaped the carnage in that classroom, who live with that every single day and who inspire and encourage us that we must do better. I'm hopeful because of heroic small-town leaders like now my good friend, Pat Lodra, First Selectwoman. And I'm hopeful because of dedicated leaders from not just small towns, but all the way through to our President, to our Vice President, and Secretary Duncan. I'm hopeful because I know we have a governor who is committed to common sense gun laws, not just as an elected official, but as a parent. On December 14th, I saw Governor Malloy. He was there with the families, and I saw his heart break as every parent's heart broke across this country. Governor Malloy was there doing one of the hardest things anyone can do, which is, as a parent, to share the news with another parent that their child will not be coming home. He has been there for this community day after day, and he will be there in the weeks and months and years ahead to help Newtown heal. And for that, we owe him tremendous gratitude. Thank you. Thank you, Governor Malloy, for your continued strong support for Newtown in the wake of this tragedy. Thank you for your unwavering commitment to common sense gun reform in this state and for being a leader in this cause across the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce our governor, my friend, Dan Malloy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please. I know people have been recognized before, and so I want to begin by also recognizing my friend and partner, the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Connecticut, Nancy Wyman, who's done such a fantastic job these last several months. Pat, you've been recognized. It's great to see you and be with you yet again. Congresswoman, thank you for that overly generous introduction. I very much appreciate it, as I appreciate your hard work and commitment to these issues and many other issues that you're fighting for on a daily basis on behalf of our shared constituents. Senator Murphy and Senator Blumenthal, thank you each for your leadership on these issues as well. It's very much appreciated. And obviously, I'm looking forward to seeing my friend Arne Duncan shortly. Thank him for his leadership on these issues, and particularly on all of the good work that he's done on education reform in our nation, and his ability to hold up a mirror to us so that we see our frailties and weaknesses and that we work to overcome them. And of course, any day that you can spend any portion of your day with Joe Biden tends to be a good day, and I look forward to seeing him, and I'm going to bet that he's going to mention either his grandmother or his grandfather at some point in his talk with us. 2 months, and actually to some new friends or acquaintances or people who I share a common bond with, the family members who have been most adversely impacted. It's good to see so many of you here, and I want to thank you also for your strength and your leadership. 2 months ago, our state became the center of a national debate after a tragedy we never imagined could possibly happen in our state and in one of the most beautiful communities within our state. The horrific tragedy at Sandy Hook Elementary School brought home the fact that we are not immune to problems that face the nation at large, that we can never become complacent in our efforts to ensure the safety of our residents. Since that day, all of us have experienced grief. We have all mourned the loss of innocence. We have cried for the families and survivors. And we have done so knowing that at some level we will never be the same as we were before December 14th. We have changed. And I believe it is now time for our laws to do the same. I want to applaud the Vice President and President Obama for their work on these issues. Whatever laws we have on our books in our state, however, need to be, we do need strong leadership from the federal government and legislation to be passed. It has never been clearer, I think, on that point. The proposals outlined by the White House will make us and our children safer, and there should be no doubt about it. And as the President pointed out just a week ago, the families in Newtown and Aurora and Tucson and every other community that has been affected by gun violence deserve an up or down vote. There is good work being done already in our state as well. In January, I convened a Sandy Hook Advisory Commission to make specific recommendations in the areas of school safety, mental health, and gun violence prevention. The General Assembly also convened a bipartisan task force to look at many of the same issues. But even as those good efforts continue, and despite the strong leadership and goodwill in Connecticut's House and Senate, we run the risk of letting the critical moment in our history pass. None of us want that to happen, and none of us should let it happen. Connecticut, too, therefore, must change. Today, in a letter to Connecticut's legislators, I outlined a plan for common-sense gun violence prevention, and I believe can serve as a critical first step in our efforts to make Connecticut safer. We can do it by answering some simple questions. Questions like, why is the gun used at Sandy Hook not classified as an assault weapon under today's Connecticut law? Why are background checks required when someone buys a gun in a store, but not when they buy it privately or at a gun show? Why is there no limit on the size of magazines that can be used in semi-automatic weapons? These are questions we can answer now. While some problems are more complicated and require further study, including the intersection of mental health and gun ownership, there are clear common-sense steps that we can take right now to improve Connecticut's gun laws. I believe we need to enhance and expand our system of background checks so that whether you buy a gun from a dealer, a private individual, or at a gun show, you must go through a background check before anyone hands you a firearm. We need to expand the permitting process to cover more guns and keep guns away from people who have been convicted of violent crimes or making violent threats. And we must track the sale of ammunition as well as firearms. We need to ban large-capacity magazines and allow the sale only of magazines that hold 10 rounds or less. We need to strengthen our assault weapons ban. We have decent laws on the books today, but that law didn't prevent the sale of an AR-15. I am proposing that we change the definition of an assault weapon to any semi-automatic that has at least one military characteristic and ban the sale of these weapons in our state. We need to expand laws around gun storage so that these weapons don't fall into the hands of people who should not have them. Gun owners have a responsibility to store their weapons safely, and they should be held accountable if a person is injured because they were improperly stored. And we need to increase the responsibility of those involved in the sale and use of guns. The fact is that if you sell guns or work at a gun range and you see or know of illegal activity involving a firearm or banned magazine, you have a responsibility to tell someone in law enforcement. If you see someone illegally using a banned weapon or a magazine, you have an obligation to do something about that. There's more we can and should do, which is why I'm also asking the commission I put together to study some important things. Things like what changes we should consider to mandatory reporting laws regarding behavioral and mental health, and whether there are additional gun storage requirements that should be mandated by law. These are tough questions, and I hope that my commission and the General Assembly's bipartisan task force will both consider those and other important potential reforms. But I hope that the steps I'm outlining today can frame the discussion about how we can start moving right now in a very real and fundamental way towards more meaningful gun violence prevention laws. Finally, let me be very clear. I have a great deal of respect and belief in our Second Amendment. We have a fundamental right to bear arms in this country, but with every right comes responsibility. These proposals endorse reasonable measures to improve public safety while preserving a citizen's constitutional rights. Shootings like this are becoming all too common occurrences in our country, and that must change. While the tragedy at Sandy Hook provided a devastating reminder of the need for more sensible policy, the problem of gun violence is not confined to one community. Communities throughout our state, particularly in our largest cities, continue to suffer from the scourge of gun violence regularly. The time to act on that is now. The Sandy Hook tragedy happened in a school, but we don't want the next time to have it happen in a movie theater or a shopping mall or a ball game or on a street corner, for that matter, in any one of Connecticut's cities or towns. While there are limits to what can be done, we don't want to be there the next time something happened that we could otherwise have prevented. The thousands of people who came to Hartford last week to push for stronger gun violence prevention laws came with one underlined message: we need a vote. I can think of no better way to honor those that we've lost than to use the lessons learned and to have a vote on a bill that will make our state and our country safer. Thank you. Thank you. Let me welcome two distinguished public servants in their own right who have had distinguished careers before entering the Senate and now are representing our state so wonderfully and magnificently in all that needs to be done, and particularly in helping lead our country in this discussion. Senators.
Thank you. We're nearing the end of this conference, and I want to, again, can't thank you too many times for being here. Thank you, every one of you, for the work that you are doing, the work that you will do on helping to reduce gun violence in America. And let me begin with a very blunt truth. The governor is right, that Newtown changed all of us. I went to Newtown as a public official, but what I saw was through the eyes of a parent. And the world is different for me today because of what I saw and heard on that day. And Newtown has transformed America. And we need to build on that sense of urgency going forward. And let's face another blunt truth. Preventing gun violence was thought to be untouchable politically 2 months ago. That unspeakable horror has given us unstoppable momentum, and we must seize this historic moment. But here's another blunt truth. It's not only about Newtown. Since Newtown, 1,900 other Americans, 1,900 other victims have perished as a result of gun violence in rural communities, on the streets of our cities, all across America. It's not about one place, and it's not about one solution. There is no single solution. There has to be a comprehensive strategy, and no one state can do it alone. Connecticut cannot do it alone. We need national action, and it has to be action, not just words and rhetoric or thoughts. Today, we have been fortunate to have some of the experts in our country come forward with evidence for action that has to be taken nationally. Today has truly been a summit of hope, but also a call to action for a ban on high-capacity magazines that enabled Newtown and Tucson and other horrific massacres across the country. A law to prevent illegal trafficking, straw purchases, which right now are done with impunity all across the country. Our state borders know no respect for guns. Illegal trafficking is a poison that crosses state boundaries as easily as cars or airplanes. And that poison must be stopped, as must be also assault weapons like the one used in Newtown and other horrific massacres. And finally, we need to be mindful about criminal checks, criminal background checks, strengthening NICS, strengthening that database by making sure that every state provides the information that is necessary for any state to be safe. We are not a nation of individual, isolated islands of states when it comes to stopping gun violence. No state is an island, and no state can be safe as long as any of our states have lax or non-existent laws. And that's why a federal action agenda is necessary. That's what we're talking about today, a national agenda, and you are part of it. The President has said, absolutely rightly, that he won't achieve an end to gun violence. No public official will do it. It's the American people speaking and standing up and making sure that we hold answerable and accountable every public official so that they are mindful of what Chris McDonald said so eloquently on this stage. It's not just about the law, it's about a moral responsibility. It's about a moral responsibility to our children, the children who perished, keeping faith with them, the brave educators who sought to save them, and about making sure that we do something about mental health and about school safety as well. Let me just finally thank Chris Murphy, who has been a tremendous ally on this subject. I don't think two senators in the United States Congress have operated and worked together so well on so important a subject. And I look forward to continuing that work with him and thank him for spearheading this conference today and to say we still have a lot of work to do. We cannot be complacent. We need to make sure that Connecticut stays at the forefront, as we have been proudly, of gun violence prevention. And I want to thank the governor and our legislative leaders who are here today for making sure that we stay in the leadership across the nation. And to our law enforcers, you know, we've heard from this very stage how necessary enforcement is to making sure that laws are not just letters on a page or in the statute books or in the courts, but they are real-life limits to make us safer everywhere we go. Thank you for being here today. We can do it. We can win this battle. The opposition will continue to say the Connecticut effect is passing, but we know that Connecticut will lead the nation. The Connecticut effect will accomplish and achieve an end to gun violence in this nation. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Senator Blumenthal, to Governor Malloy for your amazing work in leading the state legislature to a place that we can be proud of as a state. Again, thank you to our wonderful panelists. I continue to mete out acknowledgments, but let me just acknowledge the one additional statewide elected official who's here with us today. Thank you very much, Denise Merrill, our Secretary of State, for being here today. I hope that we leave here with a sense of collective action as to what we need to do at the federal level. We have within our power, as you've heard here today on two very powerful panels, we have within our power the ability to take steps at a national level that will greatly reduce the chance that any community has to go through what Newtown has gone through, and greatly reduce the numbers of families throughout cities and suburbs, rural areas across this country who have to deal with the everyday tragic loss of life that comes from gun violence since that horrible day in December. We have within our power those policy changes. And so let me tell you what I believe, and I think it's what both Dick and I and our delegation believe. What we're going to be bringing to Washington is we approach go time, and we are in the hour of decision in Washington, D.C. Over the next several weeks, the committees of cognizance in the Senate will be reporting out legislation that we're going to have a chance to vote on. Members are going to be making decisions on which side they stand. On the side of the status quo and the gun lobby, or whether they stand on the side of change, on the families who are represented here today. We're going to make those decisions. And when it comes to my voice, here's what I'm going to argue for. I'm going to stand up and say that no private individual in this country should have access to military-style assault weapons and 30-round magazines. That if a gun was designed to kill people, then it probably should be the hands of professionals who has it in their job description to do that. I'm going to argue for a school safety discussion that I think speaks truth to what we've heard here today. That if we're going to put police officers in our schools, let's do it the right way to make sure that they are facilitating a positive school culture. And let's acknowledge that the most important thing we can do is make schools a welcoming place where no one feels ostracized, where no one feels disconnected, where everyone is welcomed with the kind of positive behavioral supports that make schools positive, safe places to learn. And we're going to make this simple argument, that every single child, individual, and family who needs and wants access to the mental health system of this country should get it not as a matter of the amount of money that they have in their pocket, but as a matter of right of living in the most powerful, affluent country in the world. If we can have this common sense discussion about guns and about school safety and about mental health, which, by the way, I think is where 70% of the American public is. There are extremes on both sides of all of these agendas, but 70% of the American public believes in the kind of common sense gun restrictions that we're talking about, absolutely thinks that we should make schools a safer place in the right way, and certainly believe that we should have universal access to mental health for people who want it. That's an issue that enjoys broad bipartisan support across this country. I think we can get that done. But it's this kind of turnout and this kind of support from the administration that makes that possible. Here's the last thing I'll say. And we all view the last 30 days through our individual prisms. I'm one of these people that often sees these awful things happening in this world and wonders what lies inside of us. Right? What's the inherent nature of each one of us? Are we good people that occasionally do bad things, or is goodness a learned behavior that lays on top of more evil things? And it's days like December 14th that caused us to think about that inherent question about who we are as a race, as a species. As awful as that day was, it answered that question once and for all for me. 10 minutes of mental illness that masqueraded as evil in that school, that then was layered on top with thousands of actions of heroic humanity, whether it was a principal running to the gunfire to try to stop it as other people were running the other way, whether it was a paraprofessional wrapping her hands around a young boy in her charge to shield him from the bullets, whether it was the millions of people across this country and this world who sent teddy bears and letters and phone calls and gifts to the community, or whether it's the families from Newtown and from Bridgeport and from New Haven and from Hartford who could have just slunk back and instead have stepped forward to try to make a change. That's who we are. We're good. We're great. And there's no 10 minutes of massive destruction that can erase that truth. That's why I think we'll get something done when it comes to gun violence. That's why I think we'll get something done when it comes to mental illness, because in the end, our better instincts do win out. Having Vice President Biden here today, having Secretary Duncan, is further confirmation that we're going to be able to get something done. Having Dan Malloy's amazing leadership in Hartford is further confirmation that Connecticut will lead the way. Thank you all for being part of an amazing conference. We are going to take a slight break before we welcome to the stage those that will introduce Secretary Duncan and the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. Thank you for a great conference today, everyone.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senator Blumenthal, Senator Murphy, Congresswoman Esty, Governor Malloy, Lieutenant Governor Wyman, Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, Mayor Finch, First Selectman Lodra, and the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
Good afternoon. I'm Arne Duncan. We have a number of speakers here. I'm going to keep my remarks very, very brief, but the Vice President and I are thrilled to be here, and thanks to all of you for convening us. I hate that we have to come here to talk about this topic, but it is hugely important that we do that, and I appreciate the leadership and the courage that this community has shown. To the family members, to the community of Sandy Hook and Newtown, our thoughts and prayers are with you every single day. And what you have gone through and what you will continue to go through, it breaks our heart. And whatever the Vice President, the President, and myself can do to help you through this process, we want to do that. For so many of us, the issue of reducing gun violence is a very personal one. And growing up on the south side of Chicago, it's quite frankly something that's haunted me from the time I was a little boy. I grew up playing basketball in many of the inner city communities and had older teenagers who looked out for me and who actually helped to protect me. Far too many of them ended up being shot, and when you're shot and killed, and we grow up and see your mentors and role models dying, that has a huge impact on you. When I went off to college in 1984, Benji Wilson, who at that time was the #1 high school player in the country, was shot outside his high school. Had a huge impact. When I came back to Chicago to run an inner-city after-school tutoring program, and I Have a Dream program, one of my first memories is one of our young man, Terrence Wright. His teenage brother was shot again in the afternoon, and going to that funeral and trying to help that family through that process was brutal. And then years later, when I led the Chicago Public Schools, we lost one child due to gun violence every 2 weeks, an absolutely staggering rate of loss. We did things that no public school should have to do. We created burial funds for families that couldn't afford to bury their children. We created a fund to put out to try and get information leading to the killers. And I thought it couldn't get any worse, and unfortunately it's gotten worse in Chicago, and tragically your community has been impacted like no other. Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes you pick the time, sometimes the time picks you, and sadly the time has picked us. And I'm just convinced as a country, if we don't move forward in a thoughtful way to do something to protect our babies, it will never happen. And we can debate how to get there, and it's a very open and honest debate. We should have that. But I just have two simple goals in mind. We want a lot fewer dead children and dead adults, and we want a lot fewer children living in fear. And if we can agree on those two goals, which I think everyone across this country can, we can find a way to get there. And if we think the current status quo is unacceptable, if we think the current status quo is acceptable, I just can't, I'll never accept that. For me, the status quo is untenable, and we have far too many children growing up living in fear. Behind my wall in my office in Chicago, I kept a picture that one of our teenagers had drawn for me. It was a picture of him as a fireman. And then his caption that he wrote on it was, "If I grow up, I want to be a fireman." And it's a really deep concept. And to think about what that means for so many of our young kids today who think about, if I grow up, and everything we're trying to preach to them about going to college and building careers and thinking long term, if you're just trying to survive, if you're living with that level of fear every single day, what does that do to you psychologically? What does that do in terms of your ability to think long term and plan for the future and not get caught up in the craziness? We need all of our children, whether it's in Newtown or South Side Chicago or in Colorado or wherever it might be. We need all of our children when I grow up and having that confidence. And we have to work together to get there. The Vice President walked through a number of things that we're proposing. We're open to other ideas. We're open to critique. But together, we have to act. We should have a great conversation. We should ask the hard questions. But together, our country, our children, our families deserve something better. We're going to try and provide as much leadership as we can. The leadership coming from the state has been extraordinary. We have to partner together. We have to find common ground. And if we do that, all of our babies, all of our children will grow up in a much, much better environment. I'll stop there. It's my honor to introduce someone I have tremendous respect for, the Mayor of Bridgeport, Mayor Finch. Mayor?
Thank you. 2 months later, the December 14th tragedy targeting young children in Newtown remains incomprehensible. I suspect it will so forever. The only thing that I think could rival the incomprehensible nature of that is for us not to act. Too many times during the last year, our nation has experienced the shock of mass shootings. Even more frequently, mayors must cope with the gun violence that occurs on the streets of our city, and that's why so many mayors, my fellow mayors, join me here today. Every day, 50 children and teens are shot. Every day, 8 of them die. Every day in America, every year in America, 100,000 people are shot, and 1/3 of them die. Mayors are tired of burying our young and tired of growing old waiting for Congress to act. We all agree. I know we all agree. It's time for this senseless violence to stop. In Bridgeport, we're taking positive steps to end our violence. In just 6 weeks, we've taken almost 700 guns off the streets by buying them back. Ironically, the first gun we bought back was a Bushmaster. In 1995, and soon again, we're going to be distributing trigger locks. We distributed about 1,000 back then, and we hope to distribute thousands more in the near future. In the past year and a half, thanks to the President and thanks to you, Mr. Vice President, the stimulus funds have given us 50 new police officers in the city of Bridgeport, thanks to your support of the COPS program. We thank you for that. And we're working with you, Governor Malloy, and Professor David Kennedy in his anti-gun violence model to bring that to our city. Thank you very much. Thanks to you, Mr. Vice President, and the President, and your leadership, you're now promoting the most comprehensive common-sense gun legislation to be put before Congress in more than 40 years. Thanks to Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy and Representative Esty for your leadership in organizing today's program. Connecticut believes it's time to act. I want to commend my other chief elected officials, especially our dear Pat Lodra. Her leadership and her strength during what is an incomprehensible and difficult circumstance, certainly one that no mayor wants to have to go through. She served with compassion and dignity, like a lot of elected officials do. But Pat, you're truly amazing. And in standing off stage, I must tell you that I had a time, the first time really, that we've had to talk since the event, and I was almost unable to come out here and talk, hearing the stories of what the parents and what Pat had to go through and what the governor had to go through. Hats off to all of you for what you've done for us. Pat?
The events of December 14, 2012 galvanized the world's attention unlike any similar event in recent history. People all over the world reacted in horror, with genuine grief and disbelief that such a murderous act could be committed in a town like Newtown, a mid-sized, somewhat affluent community with fine and caring schools, a love for families and children, a place where safety is a core value committed to by all. We Newtowners knew, and the world soon knew, that we did nothing wrong. Our actions did not invite this tragedy, yet it came upon us with a vengeance, and as the world could then see, it could happen anywhere. The cries of "never again" were soon heard loud and clear. Never again will we turn the other way after such a tragedy and not try to understand and mitigate those factors which contribute to violence. Never again will we accept the ideological posturing of those who would have us believe that the changes needed are too complex and too difficult to achieve. Never again will we look the other way. Thank you. It is time to act. Act for the families in Sandy Hook who lost a loved one. Act for the 15 people killed in Columbine High School. Act for the 33 killed at Virginia Tech. Act for the 6 killed in Tucson and for the 12 killed in Aurora. Act for the nearly 7 deaths per day from gun violence among those ages 1 to 19. Don't let the tragedy in Sandy Hook be just another event in a long list of killings after which no meaningful legislative action took place. I believe that we, the people, are rightly demanding a response from our government leaders, and we are seeing action at both the state and federal levels. We are positioned well with courageous, effective, and committed legislators and leaders at all levels who know and understand the issues and who will fight for the necessary changes in policy, regulation, funding, and research. We are privileged today to be joined by one of the best soldiers in the fight for change, a legislator and leader of long and distinguished service, a man whose leadership of the Federal Task Force on Gun Violence will generate proposals, will forge consensus and establish common ground, and will move this agenda as well as any official is able to do. Please welcome our esteemed Vice President, my friend, Mr. Joe Biden.
Thank you. Pat, thank you very much. Please, thank you. Thank you. Mr. President, thank you for the opportunity to allow Senators Blumenthal, Murphy, and Esty to host this conference or this meeting here today. And I say to Dan, to Governor Malloy, Governor, would it be that every governor in the country acted as swiftly, decisively, and as courageously as you have? And I mean that sincerely. Dan and I have been meeting, the governor and I should say, the governor and I have been meeting from almost the week after this happened. He's been to Washington a number of times. But you know, I had a grandpa named Ambrose Finnegan. He used to say, you know, he used to say, what the hell's so funny about that?
I bet them that you would talk about your grandmother.
I love my grandfather. And my grandfather was a very wise man. He was brilliant, not just because he was Irish, but he used to say, all kidding aside, he used to say, you know, in times of crisis, America gets lucky. What happens is the right people seem to be in the right spot. Well, I tell you, I've been around a long time.
I'm the guy who wrote the first assault was banned. I wrote the Biden crime bill, the thing to put 100,000 cops in the street. I got elected when I was 72 as a 29-year-old kid. But I've never seen an array of officials who are as committed and talented, and I mean this sincerely, as what is called for and needed right now, right at this moment, and right in this state. You know, you got a former Attorney General. You know, I don't want to turn this into a mutual admiration stuff, but you got an Attorney General who was the chief law enforcement officer for years and years in the state, who's now in the Senate at a moment on the committee that is of consequence, that where he is, as old joke goes down my way, he's forgotten more about this issue than most people will know. You've got a young new guy who feels it in his blood, in his bones, in his, the passion with which he brings to this debate in the Congress. Chris has just been relentless, and then Elizabeth, I think that my guess is the people of your district and the people of Newtown not only appreciate your talent, your competence, but you just have a way. You have a way of bringing a sense of. I think it matters. People know how much you care about this, and it matters. And so I want to thank them for hosting this and for inviting me. And and by the way, Jim Himes is here. Jim, poor Jim has met me before, and we ended up on Bill's mantle in the same picture. So I don't know whether he's going to be able to live it down. But I say this, and I know there's a lot of press here, a lot of press. I say this with every ounce of sincerity that I can muster, that really the class of the field in our administration is the guy you just heard from, Arne Duncan. He's a guy who's taken this job as a Secretary of Education with an absolute commitment and passion to education and protecting kids. This is the guy who was a great basketball player at Harvard, played professional basketball in Australia. This is the guy who came back, could have done anything he wanted, and he went and he worked in the South Side of Chicago in a tutoring program for kids in real trouble. Then ended up running the Chicago school system, and you could tell, you could tell, and I could watch your eyes by the timbre of his voice, how strongly he feels about this and how deep it goes. Because, folks, the one thing I think all of you, I hope you believe, I believe, there is much we can do. There is much we can do. The thing that is most frustrating but understandable is, in many cases I travel all around the country, is the sense of hopelessness. People say, well, how are we going to deal with any of this? And I get asked on the shows I do and these large audiences, I get asked about, well, what's the one thing? What's the one thing that can be done? There is no one thing to be done. When you say that, people get a sense like, God, then there's no answer. There are multiple things that can and must be done, totally within our power, totally within our control, that will fundamentally alter the situation we find ourselves in. Ladies and gentlemen, I should have begun by saying that I had a chance to meet with two of the parents for half an hour before they had to leave. I'm going to meet with those of you who are willing to meet with me afterwards, and I met with an awful lot of you already. And but I say to all of you, I genuinely admire your courage. And I think I understand a little bit about it. This is not easy for you. Because sitting here, listening to the speakers, and just being in this room, knowing the subject, causes you to relive the moment. Having lost a child and a wife in a sudden burst of, not gunfire, but a truck. You have a hell of a lot more courage than I had. And we owe you a debt of gratitude for being willing to stay in the ring. So I say to all of you, once again, my heart goes out to you. I deeply admire your courage. And quite frankly, having tried it myself, I can't imagine how you did it. I didn't have the courage to do what you're doing. I can't imagine it. But there's one thing I can imagine. I can imagine how we will be judged as a society if we do nothing. I can imagine that. I can predict that, what will be written of us 20 and 30 years from now if we don't act. When I think about all the courage you've shown, it's not too much to ask the political establishment in this country, the members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, state legislators, governors, to show some political courage too. You know? When the president called me in, and we have lunch once a week together where there's nothing on the agenda, and he said, Joe, look, he said, you don't have to do this if you don't want, but I'd like you to lead this effort. And the way he said it was a reflection of what sort of the standing assumption is in American politics today, that this is kind of a third rail of politics, that if you take this on, somehow there will be a severe political price to pay for doing it, because that's what's happened in the past. That's what's happened in the past. People say, and you read, and people write about the political risk and why they're unacceptable to take on. I say it's unacceptable not to take these on. It's just simply unacceptable. It is not something we can't fail to do. So I say, and every one of these people on the stage have done that. But what I say to my colleagues who will watch this and listen to this, I say to you, if you're concerned about your political survival, you should be concerned about the survival of our children. And guess what? I believe the price to be paid politically to those who refuse to act, who refuse to step forward. Because America has changed on this issue. You should all know the American people are with us. They should know. You all should know. There's a moral price to be paid for inaction. And ladies and gentlemen, the organized opposition, the same opposition that I've been involved with for 40 years of my career, and my law enforcement friends have been as well. They've thrown up question after question. Not because they're looking for answers, but because not because they're driven by facts, not because they're looking for a way forward, because they're looking for roadblocks. So every one of these chats I do on the internet, every one of these things I do on Facebook, it's amazing some of the questions that seep in. They say, all you're going to do, Biden, you and the president, you're going to deny law-abiding citizens their rights under the Second Amendment. Not true. They say assault weapons. They say assault weapons like the AR-15 are needed for self-protection and recreation. They are not. There's plenty of ways you can protect yourself and recreate without an AR-15. They say it isn't about guns. They're wrong. It is about guns. And let me say at the outset to all the press, no law-abiding citizen in the United States of America has any fear that their constitutional rights will be infringed in any way. None. Zero. Look, common sense facts are these assault weapons are unnecessary and dangerous weapons that put our law enforcement personnel at risk. You guys know a lot of departments around the country I've been working with the police agency for 35 years. I'm going to say something outrageous. You had no better friend over the last 35 years than me. And what do I hear from you all? I hear from one community to another. You're being outgunned. They're being outgunned. It's not just about protecting the community. It's about protecting the people who protect the community as well. Look. Then I hear them say, well, it's about our culture. The facts are our culture's not killing 25 people today. It's weapons with high-capacity magazines. It's criminals who get guns without going through a background check. I also get told, they say there are too many of these weapons out there already, so why do anything about putting more out? The ban will have no effect. That's certainly no argument to continue to proliferate weapons we don't think are healthy in society. For the President and me, it's a simple proposition, tragically highlighted by what happened in Newtown. We can't remain silent. We have to speak for all those voices. We have to speak for those 20 beautiful children who died 69 days ago, 12 miles from here. They can't speak for themselves. We have to speak for the voice of those 6 adults who died trying to save the children in their care that day who can't speak for themselves. You have to speak for the 1,900 people who have died at the other end of the gun just since Sandy Hook in this country. 1,900 just since that day. They can no longer speak for themselves. Caitlin Cornett, a 20-year-old Kentucky woman, shot and killed in a college parking lot after a domestic dispute. Aiden Perea, a 4-year-old boy, probably just learning how to tie his shoes, who was caught in a drive-by shooting in Kansas City. Hydra Pendleton, a 15-year-old Chicago girl, who the President and I literally watched pass the reviewing stand in front of the White House as a majorette on Inauguration Day, shot dead in a park near her school. Arnie knew of her, an honor student. A kid played in the band. The kid was both her parents were college educated. She was working like hell. She went to the park and sitting on a swing. 12 noon. Janae McFarland was gunned down just hours before her sister joined President Barack Obama for a gun safety event in Chicago. You all saw that on television. 25 people dead from gun homicides every day in this country, and it doesn't count the scores of mothers, sons, daughters, whose lives have been irrevocably altered. Folks, let me say this as clearly as I can. There are going to be a lot of voices in this debate, but I am absolutely determined, the President is absolutely determined, that the loudest voices will be for the voices of the people who lost their voice. They will be the loudest voices in this debate. We intend to speak for them. Enough is enough. We have an obligation to act. And we are taking that obligation seriously, responsibly, and we're acting expeditiously. When the President asked me to do this, I put together a format. We met with every possible stakeholder in this debate. 229 separate groups, not individuals, groups we met with. Governors, mayors, county executives, law enforcement officers, mental health experts, survivors of gun violence, religious groups, sporting organizations, the NRA, the gun owners groups, representatives from the movie and video game industries. And there's a generic consensus, not unanimity, a consensus that is different than existed when I did this back in 1992 and 93 to get to the 94 bill. The consensus is emerging. There's a consensus in the types of action everybody thinks are reasonable we should take. I prepared for the President a document reflecting that consensus, as he asked me to do, backed up by the best data available. And the conclusions we reached were as follows. First, we need universal background check system. Universal. Every single weapon sold. Up to 40% of the guns that are currently purchased through private sales that don't require background checks. If we change that, we can help significantly reduce the number of guns that end up in the wrong hands. We need to make sure that states who have all the records of the felons in their state, all the records of the fugitives in their state, all the records of those who are adjudicated mentally incapable of owning a gun in their state. But there's tens of thousands, probably, we don't know the exact number, millions of those records that never get to the national database. So when you go to Dick's Sporting Goods store to buy a weapon, buy a gun, and your name gets run through, you may be a convicted felon in Montana, Delaware, New York, Connecticut, Florida, and your name never comes up, so you're sold the gun. Second, we can improve safety if we limit, not eliminate, limit high-capacity magazines. Mark Kelly, a friend of mine, Gabby Gifford's husband, pointed out that if the shooter in Tucson had a 10-round magazine instead of a 30-round magazine, little granddaughter of a friend of mine from Wilmington, Delaware, who used to manage the Philadelphia Phillies, she'd be alive today. Because when changing his magazine, a woman leaned over in the crowd and knocked his arm, and that's how they subdued him. It makes a difference. Wouldn't have saved everybody. Wouldn't have saved everybody. But the last two people shot would be alive. There's no rational reason why someone ought to be able to carry a 100-round drum like the Aurora shooter carried. What rationale for that? And how does that affect his constitutional right if he's denied the right to have a 100-round drum? Third, we can reduce gun violence if we reiterate and strengthen the assault weapons ban. Cops are being outgunned. 37% of police agencies, people on the front lines, reported in a report in 2010 survey that they did that they saw an increase in the criminal use of assault weapons after the ban expired in 2004. Fourth, we need a federal gun trafficking statute. Most of you think there probably is one. There is no federal gun trafficking statute. And the reason why it's so important is how we can make sure the prosecutors can go after the so-called straw purchasers. So many of these weapons that are getting into hands illegally are bought by people who can pass the background check. They buy in bulk and they go from store to store to store, and then they resell or they get paid for doing that by criminal organizations or individuals. A federal gun trafficking law would allow us to get at that more clearly and other things I won't bore you with. Fifth, we can reduce gun violence if there are more sworn law enforcement officers on the street. Dick remembers back when I first wrote the crime bill, put 100,000 cops in the street in the Clinton administration. Everybody said, no, we tried that. We never did that before. And we turned it to community policing. Gun murders dropped precipitously since we passed that law in '94. And now what's happening? We got lucky here with Mike being able to help him, but we got stymied in continuing to fund the cops bill the way we should, the cops program. And so you have roughly, I think it's 17,000 shields that are authorized to be had in communities all across America sitting in a drawer because of the recession has absolutely crushed the ability to maintain law enforcement sizes. In cities like Camden, New Jersey, they're basically eliminating their police department. Flint, Michigan, significant cuts. So we call for funding back those 15,000 law enforcement officers who lost their job because of the recession in the name of public health and public interest. Sixth, we should encourage, not prevent, serious research on gun violence. You say, well, don't you do that already, Joe? After, when we passed, in order to get the legislation passed in '94 that I'd written, we had to agree that it had to be reauthorized in 10 years, along with the Violence Against Women Act, which they're holding up now, which I wrote, which baffles me, but anyway. And so, 2004, in the last administration, they decided not to try to reauthorize it. We didn't have votes to reauthorize it. A little known fact went along with now eliminating the magazine limits and the assault and ban and a few other things. They began to attach what we call in the parlance of Washington, the Congress, riders to appropriations bills. explicitly preventing the federal agencies with the expertise from being able to keep any records on gun violence and study gun violence. So the CDC down in Atlanta, Georgia, is prohibited by law until the president acted with executive order to do studies on gun violence. The National Institutes of Health are not able to do them. It reminded me, and excuse me for elongating this, it reminded me when I was a young senator in '73 as a 30-year-old kid. My state was a big auto producer, and I remember the chairman of the board of the major auto companies wanted to come to see me, and I was very flattered. And I found out that what they wanted to do is they wanted to keep a ban on the National Highway Safety Council from being able to keep records on auto fatalities. I couldn't quite figure that one out. Ralph Nader had just written a book in '69 called Unsafe at Any Speed. Well, guess why? I didn't agree, fortunately, and the ban was lifted, and guess what he found out? They found out everybody thought people died because they got thrown through, passengers because they got thrown through the front windshield and thrown out of the car. They died because they hit their heads on the post and fractured their skulls. And what did that mean? It means that we came along and said you got to have a shoulder restraint. That costs money. Everybody didn't realize until you did the studies that the vast majority of people dying in the driver's held by the steering column. Cost money, but we did it. Said you have to have one that can collapse. And the list goes on. There's a reason why they didn't want those to be able to have all those facts. Why do you think the NRA doesn't want us having all be able to study these issues? Ladies and gentlemen, this includes getting serious studies done on what effect, if any, violent video games and media have on childhood development and behavior. We don't have any hard studies. We can't make a judgment, and there may be none. But in an informed society, we shouldn't be afraid of the facts. The seventh thing we should do is make our schools safer. This includes giving communities the option of having a school resource officer. In the so-called Biden crime bill in '94, there were 100,000 cops. They also included school resource officers. And you could apply in a community to have a law enforcement, a sworn shield, not a rent-a-cop, as they say, in your school. And the reason for that was we found out that the students got to know the law enforcement officer and would start to confide in him. They'd say, you know, by the way, there's going to be a drug deal going down after school. This is going to happen because kids don't want to have to go to the principal or go to the teachers to say those things. Well, they're not around anymore. So what we did this time was, the President and I are proposing to begin funding school resource officers, but if a community decides it rather would have, instead of a shield in the hallway or in the gymnasium, would rather have a hire school psychologist or an extra counselor, they should have the option to do that with the same money we're providing. We also propose training teachers and administrators. My wife is a full-time teacher. She says 15 credits a semester as a second lady. She's not stopped teaching. I don't mention the years anymore, but for a long time. And, you know, the answer isn't to arm our teachers. The answer is to arm our teachers with information so they can recognize the warning signs of serious mental illness in a way that we train them in first aid, not for them to act, but for them to then direct that child to the parent and those parents of the help that may be available. It includes developing best practice for preventing and responding to mass shootings so that, God forbid, there's a shooter on campus, everyone knows what to do and how to limit the damage. And finally, we should make mental health services available, especially for young people. We know the people between the ages of 16 and 25 are at a very high risk of mental illness. That's the riskiest time. We also know they're among the least likely to seek help or be able to get help. We need to fix that, and I believe we can. We need to make sure that we have enough mental health professionals on the job. When I met with all the medical associations around the country, they pointed out that the mental health experts and docs from around the country heard again and again, there are not enough mental health providers in our communities, even if people want to seek the help. So we are proposing to train more than 5,000 mental health professionals with the specific skills they'll need to serve young people in our schools and our communities. In the same way we have before by incentivizing them for tuition and a whole range of things to be able to do that. We also know that when kids leave school, too often they fall through the cracks when it comes to getting mental help for their mental illness. That's why we proposed a new initiative to let states try innovative ways to make sure those young people get the help they need or they had been getting that they lose once they get out of school. But understanding you need help isn't the only thing. Too often insurance companies don't provide quality coverage for mental health services. We're working to change that. Through the President's leadership, we've already expanded access to mental health treatment for millions of people through the Affordable Care Act. In fact, just this week, our administration put forward a new regulation around that law that will ensure that 62 million additional Americans will get quality mental health coverage. And later this year, we'll put in place the mental health parity regulations that will expand mental health coverage to millions of people. We fought for a long, long time to get that. In 2008, it finally passed, mental health parity, that you're entitled to coverage for a mental health problem just as you surely are for a broken arm. And we also need a broad discussion in this country about mental illness. Your former Senator Chris Dodd is moving to help us on that front by going out and convincing the entertainment industry to do what they can do best, do PSAs that are real, encouraging people to seek mental health so that it is no longer a stigma. Those of you who were served in the military recently, as my son coming back from Iraq, the military is now focused on that. They don't let you just leave Iraq or Afghanistan and come home. You go back and you're essentially you're deprogrammed for 4 days because they're taught to be tough guys and women to be able to shoot and kill. And they have problems. They have nightmares. They have dreams. Their heads ache. They're frightened. But they're not about to say anything. Our military has figured out it's important to say to them and say, look, it's okay. Tell me. Tell me. You having bad dreams? Tell me. Are you frightened? Tell me. We got to do that. If the military figured that out, we ought to be able to figure that out. And because they're the best we have, that we ought to be able to make it clear to people the mental illness is not the stigma that it still contains. There's still a stigma, and we need to do away with it. Not just because it's fair or accurate, because it generally prevents kids from seeking treatment that could really help them. It prevents parents from seeking help for their children. And it could genuinely change their lives. These are the contours of our plans. These are some of the things we think we have to act on. But look, if we do all of those things, all of these things, we can't guarantee there will not be another mass shooting in America. Even if we do all those things, we cannot guarantee another mother or father won't receive that dreaded phone call. And even if we do all those things, we know we can't save every single life. But we do know this, that these things, if we do them, will make life better, safer, and significantly fewer people will fall victim, as your kids did in Newtown. Fewer children will die. Fewer futures will be stamped out. So, folks, we have to act. Even if we save the life of only one child, as the President says, I have no doubt that if we take the steps proposed, we'll save many more lives. And here's the critical point. Without infringing on anyone's constitutional right under the Second Amendment, without infringing on anyone's constitutional right. And ladies and gentlemen, this time around, if you look at the polling data, the vast majority of the American people are with us. They know we have to act, and they're prepared. It's time. So with the grace of God and the goodwill of the neighbors, we ought to get this done, because now is the time to act. Thank you very, very much.